Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. They say if you camp in the wrong spot in the Appalachians, you'll wake up somewhere else. Or you won't wake up at all. Tonight, 8 true stories from campers who met something evil in those mountains. Their tents, their families, gone in seconds. Hit subscribe, smash like, comment where you're watching. Keep your lights on for this one. I'm 31, and I've been managing Smokey Joe's Diner for 8 years, long enough to know that people are predictable, that chaos can be controlled, and that there's always a logical explanation for everything. At least, that's what I believed until 3 weeks ago, when I learned that some things living in the Appalachian wilderness operate by rules so alien that human logic becomes not just useless, but dangerous. The mountains of Western Virginia have been calling to me since childhood. My grandmother's stories about the old places where things moved differently, where time stretched like taffy and sound carried messages you weren't meant to hear. She'd warn us kids away from certain hollows, certain ridgelines where the trees grew too thick and the silence pressed against your eardrums like water. Some places remember what came before, she'd whisper, her weathered hands tracing patterns on the kitchen table. And what remembers you back? I thought they were just stories. My life had been unraveling in small, predictable ways. Marcus and I had been circling each other for 4 years like 2 satellites, slowly losing orbit. The breakup was inevitable. He wanted commitment, children, a future I couldn't visualize without feeling trapped. My friends meant well with their concerned phone calls and invitations to girls' nights, but their sympathy felt like quicksand. Every "are you okay?" pulled me deeper into a depression I couldn't name. That's why I chose the backcountry permit for Shenandoah's most remote section. 8 miles from the nearest road, no cell service, no weekend warriors with their Bluetooth speakers and Instagram poses. Just me, 30 pounds of gear, and enough solitude to remember who I was before I became half of something else. The trail began innocuously wide gravel paths with wooden signs and mile markers. But as civilization fell away behind me, the forest changed. Ancient hemlocks rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy so dense that even at midday, the light filtered down green and dim. The air itself felt thicker here, heavy with the weight of centuries. Every step took me deeper into something that predated roads, settlements, the entire concept of human dominion over the natural world. By the time I reached the designated camping area, the sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. The site was perfect, a small meadow beside a creek, surrounded by trees so massive their trunks disappeared into shadow above. The sound of running water would mask any noise I made, while still allowing me to hear my surroundings. Basic safety, the kind my father had drilled into me during our camping trips when I was small. Setting up camp felt like a ritual. Each action, selecting the flattest ground, orienting my tent away from prevailing winds, establishing my cooking area downwind from where I'd sleep, connected me to something primal and necessary. I cooked pasta with dried mushrooms over my camp stove while the last light bled from the sky, and for the first time in months, the constant chatter in my head went quiet. I slept deeply that first night, dreamlessly, wrapped in the kind of silence you can only find miles from electric lights and traffic hum. The wrongness started at dawn. I woke to absolute quiet, not the peaceful quiet of morning in the mountains, but something deeper, more complete. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the trees. Only the creek continued its endless conversation with the stones, as if it alone had permission to break the silence. Standing outside my tent with coffee warming my hands, I felt the weight of that quiet pressing against me. In 20 years of camping, I'd never experienced anything like it. Mountain mornings were supposed to be full of sound birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant tap of woodpeckers. This felt like the forest was holding its breath. I convinced myself it was altitude, or seasonal patterns I didn't understand, or simple coincidence. What did I know about wildlife behavior? I was a diner manager, not a biologist. I spent my morning reading beside the creek, occasionally glancing up at the canopy, swaying gently overhead. That's when I first saw them move. It started as peripheral awareness, the sense that something large had shifted position in the trees directly above my campsite. When I looked up, everything was perfectly still. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger. That familiar prickle at the base of your skull, that means you're being watched. I tested it deliberately. Returned to my book, then snapped my gaze upward without warning. For just an instant, I caught a glimpse of something pulling back into the deeper foliage, something too large to be a squirrel, moving too fluidly to be a bird. By noon, I was certain something was up there, tracking my movements with sustained attention. Multiple somethings, positioned at different points around the clearing. I could feel their observation like heat against my skin. The shapes, when I glimpsed them, defied easy categorization. Roughly human-sized but wrong in their proportions, too elongated, joints bending in directions that made my brain stutter. They moved through the canopy with impossible grace, transitioning from branch to branch without the awkward scrambling you'd expect from any normal animal. What unnerved me most was their patience. Whatever they weren't driven by simple curiosity or territorial instinct. They were studying me, learning my patterns, my routines, the rhythm of my daily activities. As afternoon stretched toward evening, their surveillance became bolder. I caught clearer glimpses, pale skin that seemed to catch and reflect the filtered sunlight, limbs that extended and contracted like something boneless. And they were communicating with each other, soft clicking sounds that carried between trees in simple patterns. Call and response, like a language stripped down to its most basic elements. When I built my evening fire, their activity intensified dramatically. The clicking became faster, more complex. Branches creaked under shifting weight as bodies repositioned themselves around the perimeter of the clearing. Whatever light meant to them, it wasn't comfort. I grabbed my LED flashlight and aimed it up into the nearest tree. The beam caught something that made every rational thought evaporate from my mind. A hand, pale as bone, with 4 fingers easily twice the length of human fingers, and a thumb positioned where no thumb should be. It gripped a branch thick as my waist, supporting a body I couldn't quite see in the shadows beyond the light's reach. The moment my beam found it, the hand released, and whatever it belonged to flowed backward into the deeper darkness with liquid speed. But I'd seen enough. The fingers hadn't been gripping the branch, they'd been wrapped around it, like a snake coiling around prey. No human hand could bend that way. I kept the fire burning high all night, feeding it constantly while soft sounds emanated from the canopy above. Not threatening sounds, exactly, but purposeful. The whisper of bodies moving through leaves, the soft creak of wood under weight, the occasional click of their simple language. They were still there, still watching, still waiting. When dawn finally came, I discovered what they'd been doing while I huddled beside my fire. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed deep into the mud around my campsite in a perfect circle, about 15 feet from my tent. But calling them handprints was like calling a spiderweb a simple net, technically accurate but missing the disturbing complexity. Each print showed 4 impossibly elongated fingers and an oppositely placed thumb that would allow for gripping angles no human hand could achieve. The palm was ridged with patterns that looked almost like bark or scales, or something that had never been designed for the simple task of grasping. They'd been pressed into the earth with enough force to suggest substantial weight and strength. The trail of prints led to the base of an enormous oak at the edge of the clearing, and then continued vertically up the trunk. Not claw marks from climbing, but actual prints, as if whatever made them had simply walked up the side of the tree in defiance of gravity. Standing at the base of that oak, looking up into its shadowy heights, I finally understood what I'd been missing. The branches weren't natural anymore. They'd been woven together, bent and shaped into platforms and shelters that formed a complex network 30 feet above the ground. What I'd been seeing as random forest canopy was actually architecture sophisticated, purposeful, and old. Every large tree around the clearing had been similarly modified. Branches trained and grown into dwelling spaces over years, maybe decades. Storage areas constructed from living wood. Transportation routes that connected tree to tree in an elaborate network I was only now beginning to perceive. I wasn't camping in a wilderness clearing. I was standing in the town square of a settlement that existed entirely in the canopy, invisible to ground-dwelling observers. And I'd been sleeping here for 2 nights like some ignorant tourist who'd pitched her tent in the middle of someone's living room. The realization hit me with physical force, and my sharp intake of breath must have been audible because the clicking sounds above immediately intensified. They knew I'd figured it out. That's when the first one descended low enough for me to see it clearly. It hung upside down from a branch about 20 feet up, suspended by those impossible hands wrapped around the wood like pale roots. In full daylight, with nothing between us but air, I could see every detail that would follow me into nightmares for the rest of my life. The skin was translucent, almost luminescent, showing the dark network of veins beneath like a medical illustration. But it wasn't human skin. It had a texture like wet leather, slightly ridged, and it seemed to shift and flow as the creature moved. The limbs were too long, too thin, jointed in places where human anatomy didn't allow for joints. Arms that could extend and contract, legs that bent backward as easily as forward. But the most disturbing detail was its clothing. Fragments of human garments incorporated into its pale flesh, like evolutionary adaptations. A strip of flannel shirt that seemed to be growing from its torso. Hiking boots that had been modified to accommodate feet with too many joints and toes that gripped like additional fingers. Pieces of nylon webbing from backpacks, stretched and reshaped, integrated into its body like decorative scars. It tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck, and its large, dark eyes fixed on me with unmistakable intelligence. This wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely, something that had been observing humanity long enough to understand the significance of our possessions, our tools, our symbols of identity. More of them descended. 8, then 12. Then so many, I lost count. They hung from branches around the entire perimeter of the clearing, all at roughly the same height, all watching me with those dark, too intelligent eyes. And they were all wearing fragments of human clothing, human gear, human identity. That's when I noticed the other things scattered through the canopy above them. Backpacks hanging from branches like strange fruit, sleeping bags spread across platforms, camping gear carefully arranged in storage areas among the modified branches. Personal belongings sorted and displayed with careful attention to some organizational system I couldn't understand. A wallet dropped from somewhere above, landing at my feet with a soft thud. I opened it with hands that shook so badly I could barely manipulate the leather. Robert Chen, according to the driver's license. Age 34, expired 3 years ago. The photo showed a smiling Asian man with hiking gear in the background. More items began dropping. Not thrown, placed, carefully positioned in front of me like offerings, or perhaps like a merchant displaying wares. Cell phones in waterproof cases, watches, jewelry, car keys. Dozens of different items from dozens of different people, collected over what must have been years or decades. But they weren't random trophies. As I examined them, I began to see the pattern. Each item represented a choice point, a decision made by someone who had encountered these creatures in this place. The watch from someone who had chosen to stay and learn their concept of time. The wedding ring from someone who had traded human connection for something else. The hiking boots from someone who had decided that walking on the ground was unnecessary when you could travel through the trees. The clicking intensified, became more complex, and I realized they were discussing me, debating. These weren't mindless predators. They were a community making a collective decision about what to do with an intruder who had finally understood what they were. One of the creatures detached from its branch and descended further, close enough that I could see the tiny details that made it even more disturbing. Its fingers weren't just long, they were articulated with too many joints, allowing for gripping and manipulation that no human hand could achieve. Its feet had adapted similarly, with toes that could wrap around surfaces like additional hands. Most unnervingly, parts of its flesh showed small modifications, loops of skin where climbing gear had once been attached. Shallow depressions, where buckles and clasps had been incorporated so completely they'd become anatomical features. It had evolved, or been modified, to interface with human technology. It reached toward me with one impossibly long arm, not threatening but offering. In its palm lay a compass, old and brass and engraved with initials I couldn't quite read. The implication was clear. Others had made the choice to stay, to learn, to become part of whatever these creatures were building in their canopy civilization. And for one terrifying moment, I understood the appeal. Down here on the ground, I was isolated, divorced from the forest community that surrounded me. Up there, I would be part of something ancient and purposeful, connected to a network of intelligence that had been observing and learning from humanity for generations. I would never be alone again. The compass sat in that pale, wrong palm, offering me a choice between the limited, painful world of human relationships and something vast and alien and eternally fascinating. I packed my gear instead. The moment I shouldered my backpack and turned toward the trail, the entire canopy erupted in agitated motion. The clicking became a cacophony of overlapping voices, rising and falling in patterns too complex to follow. But I was already walking, each step carrying me closer to the boundary between their world and mine. They followed me. For 8 miles, they tracked my progress through the forest, moving through the canopy in perfect coordination. I never saw them directly, they were too skilled for that, but I could hear them. The soft whisper of bodies moving through leaves, the barely audible creak of branches accepting and releasing weight, the occasional click of their communication system, maintaining contact across vast distances. Every few hundred yards, items would appear on the trail ahead of me. Not dropped carelessly, but placed with deliberate precision where I couldn't avoid seeing them. A digital camera, a survival knife, a GPS unit. Each one, a story, a choice, a person who had encountered these creatures and decided that their old life was worth trading for something unimaginably different. I left everything where it lay and kept walking. At the parking area, they stopped. I reached my car and turned back to see pale shapes in the trees at the forest edge. Motionless now, watching my final choice with patient interest. The moment I crossed from federal land to the paved parking lot, they retreated into the deeper shadows and disappeared entirely. I drove to the nearest ranger station and filed a report. "Missing persons," I said. "Possible foul play." The ranger listened politely, took notes, and assured me they'd send someone to investigate. But I could see in his expression that he'd heard similar stories before: confused hikers, stress reactions, altitude sickness creating hallucinations of things that couldn't possibly exist. I didn't argue. I understood now why so many people disappeared in these mountains every year, why search and rescue teams never found bodies, never found evidence of what really happened in the deep forest places, where cellular signals couldn't reach and human authority held no weight. Because some people, when offered the choice between their limited ground-bound existence and something limitless in the canopy above, chose to climb. I kept Robert Chen's wallet. Online research revealed he'd been an experienced hiker who'd vanished during a solo camping trip 3 years ago. The search had lasted 2 weeks before being officially suspended. He was listed as missing, presumed dead, case closed. But I knew better. Robert Chen wasn't dead. He was still up there in the canopy, wearing fragments of his old life while learning to see the world from angles human perspective could never achieve. Part of a community that had been watching us, learning from us, and occasionally recruiting from us since long before we built roads through their forest. Sometimes I think about going back. Not to camp, I know better now, but to research, to understand, to document what's really living in the deepest parts of the Appalachian wilderness. I've read everything I can find about unexplained disappearances, about the indigenous stories of tree people that white settlers dismissed as superstition, about the ecological surveys that consistently find evidence of large arboreal mammals that don't match any known species. But I won't return, because I remember that moment when the compass sat in that pale palm, offering me a choice between 2 worlds. And I remember, with a clarity that terrifies me, how long I hesitated before walking away. The restaurant business feels absurdly simple now. Health inspectors, difficult customers, equipment failures, all of it just minor variations on predictable human behavior. Real terror comes from understanding that there are other forms of intelligence in the world, ancient and patient and utterly alien, that have been watching us evolve for far longer than we've been aware of their existence. And they're still up there in the canopy, clicking their simple languages to each other, wearing pieces of the lives we've left behind, waiting for the next solitary hiker to stumble into their town square and discover that the choice between worlds is always available to those brave enough or broken enough to consider it seriously. The forest remembers everything. And what it remembers most clearly is that every time we venture into the deep places, we're not just exploring wilderness, we're attending a job interview for a position we didn't know existed, in a company we can't begin to understand, offering benefits that would fundamentally change what it means to be human. Most of us decline the position and walk back to our cars, never knowing how close we came to a life lived entirely in 3 dimensions, connected to intelligence networks that span forests and generations. But some people say yes, and they're still up there, learning to see the world from angles we can't imagine, becoming something new and strange, and wonderfully terrible. The canopy is always hiring. Jessica Rivera still manages a restaurant in Richmond, Virginia. She continues to camp regularly, but never alone, and never more than 5 miles from established campgrounds. She has donated Robert Chen's wallet to his family, but has never told them where she found it. 3 months after her encounter, a wilderness photographer captured what appears to be human figures moving through the canopy of old-growth trees in the George Washington National Forest. The images were dismissed as photographic artifacts by wildlife experts, but they remain posted on several cryptozoology websites. The missing person rate in Virginia's backcountry areas has remained consistent for the past decade. Approximately 12 unexplained disappearances per year, all involving experienced hikers camping alone in remote locations. According to Cherokee oral histories, the Tree People have been recruiting from ground-dwelling communities for over 400 years. My name's David Martinez, and I'm 41 years old. I've been working as a plumber here in Knoxville for about 15 years now, mostly residential stuff but some commercial contracts too. Good steady work, you know? The kind where you're always busy but never really getting ahead. My wife Lisa teaches 2nd grade at one of the elementary schools downtown, and we've got 8-year-old twins, Emma and Jake. They're at that age where everything's an adventure, where sleeping in a tent sounds like the coolest thing in the world. We've been talking about taking a real family camping trip for years. Not the kind where you drive to a state park and camp 20 feet from your car with bathrooms and showers right there. I mean real camping, where you hike in and rough it for a few days. Lisa grew up doing that kind of thing with her dad before he passed, and she always talked about wanting to give the kids that experience. Problem was, I work about 60 hours a week during busy season, and by the time weekend rolls around, I'm usually too beat to do much more than fall asleep watching TV. But that spring, things finally lined up right. I'd just finished a big commercial job that paid really well, Lisa had spring break coming up, and the kids were old enough to handle a real camping trip without driving us crazy. We started planning in February, looking at maps, ordering gear, getting the kids excited about it. Lisa found this spot in the Cherokee National Forest, way back in the mountains, along an old logging road that barely showed up on the maps anymore. Perfect for what we wanted. Total wilderness, no other people, just us and the woods. The drive up there took about 3 hours from Knoxville. We loaded up my old pickup with everything we'd need for 5 days. The big family tent I'd bought online, sleeping bags, camp stoves, enough food to feed an army. The kids were bouncing off the walls with excitement, asking every 10 minutes how much farther it was. Emma had packed her little notebook to draw pictures of animals, and Jake brought his collection of rocks he wanted to add to with mountain rocks. Lisa was navigating with an old Forest Service map because GPS doesn't work great up in those mountains. The paved road turned to gravel after about 20 miles, then to dirt, and finally to this rough track that was barely wide enough for the truck. Trees pressed in on both sides, and I had to dodge fallen branches and washouts from old storms. It felt like we were driving back in time, getting farther and farther from civilization with every mile. We found the spot Lisa had marked on her map just as the sun was starting to set behind the ridgeline. It was perfect, a little clearing beside a creek, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The air smelled like pine and that clean mountain smell you can't get anywhere else. Complete silence, except for the water running over rocks and some birds settling in for the night. The kids immediately started exploring while Lisa and I set up the tent, their voices echoing off the trees as they found cool rocks and called out to each other. That first night was everything we'd hoped for. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, roasted marshmallows, told stories. The kids had never seen stars like that, no light pollution at all, just this incredible canopy of stars stretching from horizon to horizon. Emma tried to count them until she fell asleep in her chair, and Jake kept asking if we could live out there forever. Lisa and I sat by the fire after the kids were asleep, just enjoying the quiet and feeling like we'd finally done something right as parents. Monday morning dawned clear and cool. The plan was to spend the day hiking, maybe find some interesting rock formations or old-growth trees the kids could climb on. Lisa had studied the map and found what looked like an old trail that headed up into the mountains from our campsite. It wasn't marked as an official trail, but it showed up as a dotted line on her Forest Service map, probably an old logging road or hunting trail. After breakfast, we loaded up our day packs with water and snacks and headed out. The trail started out normal enough, just a faint path through the trees, probably made by deer or hikers over the years. The kids were in heaven, stopping to examine every interesting bug or flower, Emma sketching in her notebook while Jake collected rocks and leaves. Lisa was taking pictures of everything, trying to get shots of the kids being kids in nature. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when we came across something strange. The faint deer trail we'd been following suddenly intersected with this much larger pathway cutting through the forest. At first glance, it looked like an old road, perfectly straight, running in both directions as far as we could see through the trees. But the more we looked at it, the weirder it seemed. The path was about 12 feet wide, cut in a straight line that didn't follow the natural contours of the land like a road would. It went straight up steep slopes and down into hollows without any switchbacks or grading. Even stranger, nothing grew on it, not even weeds or moss. The soil was packed hard as concrete, like it had been compressed by enormous weight over many years. "Looks like an old road, Dad," Jake said, stepping out onto the packed earth. "But who would build a road way out here?" That's what I was wondering too. We were at least 10 miles from the nearest actual road, deep in national forest, where logging had been banned for decades. Lisa was walking along the edge of the path, taking pictures and looking puzzled. "It doesn't make sense," she said. "Look how straight it is. Roads follow ridgelines or valleys, but this just cuts right through everything." There was something else bothering me about the path, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then Lisa mentioned it. "Do you smell that?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "It's like musky, animal smell." She was right. There was this organic smell hanging over the path, like the scent you get downwind from a zoo or a barnyard, but stronger, wilder. It reminded me of the smell you sometimes get in crawl spaces under old houses, where animals have been denning for years. We decided to follow the path for a while, see where it led. The kids thought it was the coolest thing ever, their own secret road through the mountains. Emma was making up stories about who might have built it, while Jake was looking for any clues about what kind of vehicles might have used it. But the more we walked, the more unsettled I became. The path showed no signs of human use at all. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing you'd expect from a road or even a hiking trail. Instead, the hard-packed surface was covered with these deep scratches and gouges, like something with claws had been dragging heavy objects along it. About a quarter-mile down the path, Jake called out excitedly, "Dad, come look at this." He was crouched down beside what looked like footprints pressed into the hard earth. But they weren't human prints. These were huge, maybe 8 inches long, with 3 distinct toes ending in what had to be claw marks. The spacing between prints suggested whatever made them had to be enormous, way bigger than any bear. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Emma asked, her voice getting a little smaller. I knelt down beside the prints, trying to make sense of them. I'd done some hunting as a kid, knew animal tracks pretty well, but these didn't match anything I'd ever seen. Too big for a bear, wrong shape for a deer or elk. The 3-toed pattern with the claw marks looked almost like giant bird tracks, but what bird would be that size? "Maybe it's from a really old bear," I told the kids, not wanting to worry them. You know how tracks can look different depending on the ground. But Lisa gave me a look that said she wasn't buying it either. We kept following the path, and it just got stranger. The trail cut straight through rock outcroppings where any normal road would have gone around. Trees had been pushed aside or broken off, leaving these weird gaps in the forest canopy. In some places, we found thick black hair caught on bark, coarse, almost rope-like strands that definitely didn't come from any animal I knew. Then Emma made a discovery that really spooked us. "Oh, gross," she yelled from about 50 yards ahead. "There's like a huge pile of bones here." Lisa and I hurried up to where she was standing, and sure enough, there was this massive pile of bones right in the center of the path. Deer skeletons mostly, but all broken up and splintered like they'd been crushed by something with incredible jaw strength. Some of the bones still had scraps of meat and fur on them, so whatever had done this was recent. "Something really big feeds along here," I said quietly to Lisa while the kids poked around the bone pile with sticks. "David, this is starting to freak me out," she whispered back. "What if whatever made this path is still using it?" I was thinking the same thing. We'd been walking for over 2 hours, and the path showed no signs of ending. It just kept cutting through the mountains in that perfectly straight line, like some kind of highway built by giants. Let's head back, I decided. We've seen enough for one day. But that's when things got really weird. The walk back to our intersection with the deer trail should have taken the same 2 hours we'd spent walking out. We'd been following a straight path, after all. No way to get lost. Except somehow we did. The path that had seemed so straight on the way out now appeared to curve and branch. We'd passed side trails that definitely hadn't been there before, leading off into the forest in directions that made no sense. My watch said we'd been walking for 4 hours when we should have been back at our campsite already. "Dad, I think we're lost," Jake said, and for the first time, he sounded scared instead of excited. Lisa was checking her GPS, but it was showing us walking in circles even though the path felt straight. The sun was getting low, and we were all getting tired and worried. Emma started crying, saying her feet hurt and she wanted to go back to the tent. "We'll figure this out," I told them, trying to sound confident. "Worst case, we camp here tonight and find our way back in the morning." But the truth was, I was starting to panic. We had some snacks and water, but no real camping gear. It was going to get cold after dark, and we were deep in the wilderness with no real idea where we were. As it got darker, we had no choice but to stop for the night. I gathered dead wood from the surrounding forest and got a fire going while Lisa tried to make the kids comfortable. We used our day packs as pillows and huddled together around the fire, telling stories and trying to keep spirits up. Around midnight, everything changed. I was the only one still awake, feeding wood to the fire and listening to the normal night sounds of the forest. Then, off in the distance, I heard footsteps. Not human footsteps, something much bigger, walking with a steady, rhythmic pace that made the ground vibrate slightly with each step. The footsteps were coming from the direction we'd originally walked, moving along the path toward our makeshift camp. As they got closer, I could hear other sounds, heavy breathing, and what sounded like something large being dragged along the ground. I gently shook Lisa awake and put my finger to my lips. Her eyes went wide when she heard the sounds getting closer. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, we could see something moving along the path. At first it was just a dark shape, but as it got closer to our fire, I could make out more details. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but it had to be at least 12 feet tall. Its head reached above the tree line, disappearing into the darkness above the canopy. The whole thing was covered in thick, dark fur, and its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in hands with long, curved claws that scraped against the ground as it walked. But the most terrifying thing was what it was carrying. Slung over one massive shoulder was some kind of bundle, too big to be a deer, wrapped in what looked like hide or fur. The thing carried its burden without any apparent effort, like it weighed nothing at all. Lisa had covered Emma and Jake's faces, keeping them from seeing what was passing by our camp. I just sat there, frozen, watching this impossible creature walk past us on its ancient migration route. It never turned toward our fire, never acknowledged our presence at all. It just continued its steady pace down the path, its footsteps gradually fading into the distance. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn finally came, I walked over to where the thing had passed. The footprints were unmistakable, the same 3-toed tracks we'd been seeing all along the path, but fresh and deep in the soft earth beside our camp. But there were more tracks too, circling our sleeping area multiple times. Whatever it was had investigated us during the night while we slept, deciding whether we were a threat. The walk back to our original campsite took exactly 2 hours that morning. The path was straight again, no mysterious branches or curves. It led us right back to the deer trail intersection, like nothing had happened. We broke camp immediately. Didn't even stop for breakfast. Just threw everything in the truck and got the hell out of those mountains. The kids kept asking what we'd seen, but Lisa and I agreed not to tell them the truth. They were already traumatized enough by getting lost and sleeping in the woods. When we got home, I spent hours online looking up similar reports from the Cherokee National Forest. Turns out we weren't the first people to encounter something strange in those mountains. I found dozens of stories dating back decades. Hikers reporting massive bipedal creatures, strange straight paths through the wilderness, the sound of enormous footsteps in the night. Most interesting were the old Cherokee stories I found on a tribal history website. They told of ancient migration routes used by creatures they called tall walkers. massive beings that traveled the mountain paths seasonally, following food sources and returning to traditional territories their kind had used for thousands of years. According to the stories, the tall walkers weren't necessarily dangerous to humans, but they demanded respect. Their paths were sacred, used for generations beyond memory. People who encountered them were supposed to step aside and let them pass, never interfering with their ancient roots. That was 3 years ago. We've never been back to that part of the mountains, probably never will. The kids still ask about it sometimes, wondering if we can go camping there again. I always find excuses. Too busy with work, maybe next year. We should try somewhere different. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that thing we saw on the path. The way it moved with such purpose, following a route its kind had probably used since before humans ever set foot in those mountains. I wonder how many times people have stumbled onto those migration routes over the years, and how many were smart enough to just step aside and let the tall walkers pass. I also think about that bundle it was carrying. Too big to be a deer? Definitely too big to be human. But the shape was wrong for any animal I could think of. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the way the thing had circled our camp, deciding what to do about the intruders on its ancient highway. We were lucky that night. Lucky it chose to let us go. I still work as a plumber, still live in Knoxville with my family, but I don't go camping in remote areas anymore. These days, we stick to state parks with ranger stations and cell phone coverage, places where the paths were built by humans, for humans. Some roads aren't meant for us. Some highways have travelers who've been using them a lot longer than we have, and sometimes the smart thing to do is just step aside and let them pass. I'm 34 now, and I work supervising the loading dock at a distribution center outside Charleston. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent and keeps me close to Tyler. My ex-wife got the house in the divorce 2 years back, but we worked out joint custody, so Tyler stays with me every other week. He's 16 now, and like most kids his age, he'd rather be glued to his phone or Xbox than spending time with his old man. Can't really blame him for that. The thing is, before everything fell apart with Sarah, we used to take these camping trips as a family every fall. Tyler was maybe 8 or 9 when we started, and back then he loved it. Collecting rocks, trying to catch minnows in the creek, asking a million questions about every bird we saw. But after the divorce, those trips stopped. Sarah thought they were a waste of time anyway, and Tyler started getting more interested in staying indoors. Last October, I decided to try bringing back that tradition, just me and him. I figured maybe some time away from all the distractions might help us reconnect. Tyler wasn't exactly thrilled when I brought it up, but he could see how much it meant to me. He's a good kid that way, always trying to make everyone happy, even when it costs him something he'd rather be doing. I picked Monongahela National Forest because it was far enough from Charleston to feel like a real escape, but close enough that we could drive there in a few hours. I'd been researching campsites online for weeks, looking for something that would give us that wilderness experience without being so remote that Tyler would hate every minute of it. What I found was a primitive camping area about 6 miles back from the nearest parking area. No facilities, just a permit system and some basic fire rings left by previous campers. The drive up there was quiet at first. Tyler had his earbuds in, staring out the window at the mountains rolling past. But as we got deeper into the forest, he started pulling them out more often, asking questions about where we were headed. I could tell he was getting a little nervous about how isolated we were going to be. He'd never been camping without cell service before, and the reality of that was starting to sink in. We parked at the trailhead around 3 in the afternoon. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect hiking weather. I'd packed light but efficient. A 2-person tent, sleeping bags rated for 30 degrees, enough food for 2 nights, water purification tablets, and a basic first aid kit. Tyler carried his own pack with his clothes and some snacks, and I could see he was actually getting a little excited about the hike once we got moving. The trail wound uphill through dense hardwood forest, mostly oak and maple, with their leaves just starting to turn. Tyler complained about the weight of his pack for the first mile, but then he found his rhythm. We saw a few other hikers heading back toward their cars, but once we passed the 2-mile marker, we had the trail to ourselves. The campsite was perfect. A small clearing next to a creek, with a fire ring made from local stones, and enough flat ground for our tent. Tyler actually seemed impressed when we got there. He helped me set up the tent without much complaining, and when we got our camp established, he sat by the creek for a while just listening to the water. That first evening was probably the best time Tyler and I had spent together since the divorce. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, and he started opening up about stuff at school. Problems with some of his teachers, drama with his friends, worries about college applications next year. I just listened and tried not to give too much advice. It felt like we were actually talking instead of just going through the motions of a father-son relationship. We stayed up later than I'd planned, feeding the fire and talking. Tyler even put his phone away without me asking, which felt like a small miracle. When we finally crawled into the tent, I was thinking this camping trip might actually accomplish what I'd hoped for. Saturday morning started off perfect too. The creek was running clear and cold, and Tyler was more awake than I'd seen him in months. We made coffee over the camp stove and ate granola bars while planning out our day. I was thinking we might explore some of the other trails in the area, maybe find a good spot for Tyler to try fishing. That's when he spotted the buck. "Dad, look how big that thing is." I followed Tyler's pointing finger and saw what he was looking at. Standing maybe 30 feet away, on the other side of the creek, was the biggest white-tailed deer I'd ever seen outside of a hunting magazine. It had to be a 12-point buck, with antlers that spread wider than my arm span. But what struck me most wasn't its size. It was how still it stood, how directly it was staring at us. Most deer, when they notice humans, either bolt immediately or freeze for a few seconds before bounding away. This buck just stood there, looking right at us with an intensity that felt almost like curiosity. Its ears weren't even twitched forward in the alert posture you'd expect. It just watched us with what looked like calm interest. "Why isn't it running?" Tyler whispered. That was exactly what I was wondering. I'd grown up hunting with my dad before I got too busy with work and family life, and I knew deer behavior pretty well. This wasn't normal. Even during rutting season, bucks were usually skittish around humans. Tyler slowly reached for his phone, trying to get a picture. He held it up, and I could see him tapping the screen, but after a few tries, he made a frustrated noise. "The camera won't focus on it. Look at this." He showed me his phone screen, and I could see the problem. The phone's camera was focused on the trees behind where the buck was standing, showing nothing but empty forest. But when I looked up from the screen, the deer was still there, clear as day, still watching us. "Must be the lighting," I said, though I didn't really believe that. The morning light was clear and even. There was no reason the camera shouldn't pick up something that big and obvious. The buck began to move, but not away from us. Instead, it crossed the creek with careful, deliberate steps, water barely coming up to its belly. Then it started walking around our campsite in what could only be described as a perfect circle, always maintaining the same distance from our tent, always keeping its eyes on us. Tyler grabbed my arm. "Dad, this is weird, right? This isn't normal deer behavior?" I wanted to reassure him, but I couldn't. In 20 years of being outdoors, I'd never seen anything like this. The buck completed its circuit around our camp and stopped directly across from us, separated only by the cold ashes of our fire from the night before. Up close, I could see its breath forming small clouds in the morning air, even though it wasn't cold enough for that. And its eyes, they looked too intelligent, too aware, like it was studying us rather than just observing us. "Maybe we should pack up," I said quietly. As soon as I said those words, the buck's demeanor changed. It stepped closer, lowering its head slightly so those massive antlers pointed more directly at us. It made a sound I'd never heard from a deer before, a deep, guttural grunt that seemed to come from its chest. Tyler pulled closer to me. "Dad, I don't like this." I didn't either, but I tried to stay calm. I picked up a few small rocks from near the fire pit and tossed them in the buck's direction, not trying to hit it but hoping to scare it off. The rocks landed a few feet in front of the deer, and it didn't even flinch. It just continued staring at us with those unnaturally bright eyes. "We're leaving," I announced, more to hear my own voice than because I thought the deer would understand. Tyler helped me get the gear packed up, but as we started moving toward our tent to roll up our sleeping bags, Tyler stumbled over one of the tent stakes I'd driven into the ground. He went down hard, and I heard him grunt in pain. "You okay?" "Yeah, just cut my hand on this rock." He held up his palm, and I could see a clean slice across the base of his thumb. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely. A few drops hit the ground before I could get him a bandana to wrap around it. The buck moved immediately to where Tyler's blood had dripped onto the earth. It lowered its head and, with a tongue that seemed far too long for a deer, licked the ground clean. After that, everything changed. The buck's attention shifted completely to Tyler. It followed his every movement, ignoring me entirely. When Tyler moved to the left, the deer stepped left. When Tyler backed toward the creek, the deer advanced the same number of steps. Its eyes had taken on a faint glow that was visible even in the daylight, and its pupils were dilated like a predator's. "Dad," Tyler's voice was getting thin and shaky. "I feel weird." I looked at him more closely. His face was pale, and he was swaying slightly on his feet like he was dizzy. Weird how? Like, tired, really tired, and cold. It was a warm morning, probably close to 70 degrees already. There was no reason for him to be cold. I made the decision to abandon our gear and get Tyler out of there immediately. I shouldered my pack with our water and first aid supplies, grabbed Tyler's hand, and started marching toward the trail. The buck followed us. It maintained a distance of about 15 feet, matching our pace exactly whether we walked fast or slow. When I tried stopping suddenly to see if it would pass us, it stopped too. When I tried speeding up, it kept the same interval. Tyler was leaning on me heavily, and with every step he seemed to be getting weaker. After about a mile of hiking, I looked back to check on the buck and saw that we had company. 3 more deer had joined the first one, all of them with the same glowing eyes, all of them following in perfect formation. Tyler started stumbling more frequently. "Dad, I can hear them." "Hear what?" Whispers, like they're saying my name. I stopped and listened carefully. All I could hear were normal forest sounds, birds, wind in the trees, our own breathing. But Tyler was looking around frantically, as if voices were coming from all directions. "Tyler, Tyler, Tyler." He was whispering along with whatever he thought he was hearing. "They want me to come back." His lips were starting to turn blue, and when I touched his forehead, his skin was cold and clammy. Whatever was happening to him was getting worse, and it seemed directly connected to the deer. I picked him up in a fireman's carry and started jogging down the trail as fast as I could manage. Tyler was a big kid, almost my height and probably 160, but adrenaline gave me the strength to move faster than I should have been able to. The deer kept pace effortlessly. By the time I could see the parking lot through the trees, there were at least a dozen of them following us, all moving in the same coordinated formation, all with those same unnaturally bright eyes. Tyler had gone completely limp. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his skin had taken on a grayish color that scared me more than anything else that had happened. As soon as I reached the edge of the parking lot, the deer stopped. They formed a line at the tree line, like there was an invisible barrier they couldn't cross. They stood there watching as I loaded Tyler into the truck, but they came no closer. I drove to the nearest hospital like my life depended on it, which I was pretty sure it did. Tyler was unconscious by the time we arrived, and when the emergency room staff took his vitals, they were baffled. "His blood pressure is dangerously low," the doctor told me. "His red blood cell count suggests massive blood loss, but we can't find any trauma, no wounds, no internal bleeding that we can detect. It's like something just drained him." They gave Tyler 2 units of blood and kept him for observation for 3 days. He recovered completely, but he had no memory of feeling sick or hearing voices. As far as he remembered, we'd had a great camping trip until he cut his hand, and then I'd overreacted and rushed him to the hospital for a minor injury. He did develop one lasting change, though. Tyler, who had never eaten meat rare in his life, suddenly started craving steaks cooked barely beyond raw. He'd order hamburgers bloody and beg me to cook his hot dogs barely heated through. When I asked him about it, he'd just shrug and say rare meat tasted better now. I never told him what really happened on that trail. I figure he's been through enough changes with the divorce and everything else. But I think about those deer constantly. I research stories online about similar experiences, and I've found more accounts than I expected of people encountering deer with too bright eyes and unnatural intelligence in Appalachian forests. The common thread in all these stories is blood. Something about human blood seems to create a connection that these, whatever they are, can use. And they're always particularly interested in young people. Tyler still asks me sometimes when we're going camping again. I always find an excuse to put it off. Maybe next year. I tell him. Maybe when you're a little older. But honestly, I don't think we'll ever be going back to those woods. Some traditions aren't worth preserving, and some father-son bonding isn't worth the risk. Tyler's 17 now, and he started asking about getting his hunting license. He wants to learn to field dress deer and process his own meat. I keep finding reasons to delay those conversations too. Something tells me those deer are still out there, still following their own trails through those mountains, still looking for the next person foolish enough to spill blood on their territory. And something tells me Tyler's connection to them isn't completely severed. I just hope it never gets strong enough to call him back. I'm Robert Kim, and I've been working retail for the past 3 years since dropping out of college. 25 years old, living paycheck to paycheck in Charlotte, pulling double shifts at a grocery store just to make rent. My dad used to take me camping in the Appalachian Mountains when I was a kid, back before the cancer took him when I was 16. Those trips to Pisgah National Forest were about the only good memories I had left of him. Just me and him by a creek, fishing for brook trout and telling ghost stories around a campfire. So when I finally scraped together enough money for a real vacation, after 2 years of grinding, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. 3 days in the wilderness, no schedules, no customers asking stupid questions, no manager breathing down my neck. Just me in the mountains where my dad taught me how to cast a line and tie proper knots. I'd been planning this trip for months, researching primitive camping spots in Pisgah where I could disappear completely. Found a spot on some old forestry maps, a clearing by Turtle Creek, about 40 minutes off the main highway via Forest Service roads. No amenities, no other campers, just pure wilderness. The kind of place where you could scream and nobody would hear you for miles. My coworkers thought I was crazy for wanting to camp alone, but I needed the silence. Working retail teaches you to hate people pretty quickly, and I was getting to the point where every customer's face looked like a threat. The isolation would be healing, I told myself. Like therapy, but cheaper. Friday evening after my shift, I loaded my beat-up Honda with camping gear and drove into the mountains. The Forest Service roads were exactly as rough as I'd expected. Narrow, winding, barely maintained dirt tracks that hadn't seen grading equipment in years. My car's headlights carved weak tunnels through absolute darkness as I navigated by printout directions and old-school map reading. Finding the campsite took longer than expected. The forest seemed denser than my childhood memories, the trees pressing closer to the road like they were trying to swallow it completely. When I finally found the right trail marker, a rusted metal sign barely visible through kudzu vines, the dirt road dropped down a steep grade for about half a mile before opening into a small clearing beside the creek. Perfect. Exactly what I'd hoped for. Setting up camp by flashlight brought back muscle memory from those trips with my dad. My hands still knew how to stake a tent properly, how to hang food away from bears, how to arrange a camp kitchen. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the creek's constant murmur was already working its magic. For the first time in months, I fell asleep without my mind racing through work problems and money stress. Saturday morning, I woke naturally around 10. No alarm clock, no schedule, just my body deciding when it was ready. The sunlight filtering through the canopy felt like a blessing. I made coffee on my camp stove and sat by the water with a Stephen King novel I'd been meaning to read. Pet Sematary seemed appropriate for a solo trip into the deep woods. The day unfolded exactly as I'd dreamed. Reading by the creek, taking a long afternoon nap, exploring some of the deer trails that branched off from the clearing. The silence was profound but not empty, full of bird calls, wind through leaves, the endless conversation between water and stone. By evening, I was already dreading the return to civilization. That's when I made the call that changed everything. Sunday morning, instead of breaking camp, I called my manager at the grocery store, told her I was having car trouble and needed Monday off unpaid. She wasn't happy. We were already short-staffed, but I'd never called in sick or asked for anything before. She agreed, but made it clear this was a one-time exception. The extra day felt like stolen time. Monday passed in a blur of fishing. Caught nothing. Didn't care. More reading. More of that deep peace I'd forgotten existed. Tuesday morning, I finally admitted I had to pack up and head back. I had to be at work Thursday morning, which meant Wednesday driving home. But as I loaded my gear into the Honda Tuesday evening, something felt wrong with the light. The shadows were falling at the wrong angles, like the sun had shifted position when I wasn't looking. I checked my watch, 6:30 p.m., but the light looked more like late afternoon. Mountain valleys can play tricks with sunset timing, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The drive out should have been simple. Just reverse Friday night's route, follow the Forest Service roads back to Highway 276. But after an hour of driving, I still hadn't reached the main road. The forest seemed deeper somehow, the roads twisting in directions that didn't match my memory or my printed directions. My phone had no signal, which was normal in these mountains, but when I could get a brief GPS fix, the readings made no sense. According to the satellite data, I was 15 miles from the nearest parking area, but I'd only driven maybe 5 miles from my campsite. The numbers didn't add up. By full dark, I still hadn't found the highway. I pulled over at what looked like the same widening in the road where I'd stopped to check directions Friday night. Set up camp again, told myself I'd figure it out in the morning. But sitting in my tent that night, listening to what sounded like the exact same creak, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the geography here. Wednesday morning, I started early with fresh determination. I had my printed directions, my paper maps, compass bearings I'd taken when I first arrived. But every road I followed seemed to lead deeper into wilderness instead of out towards civilization. Forest Service roads that should have intersected the main highway just kept branching into more Forest Service roads, like some kind of infinite tree of possibilities that never reached a trunk. By Wednesday afternoon, my gas tank was nearly empty, and I was fighting real panic. I'd been driving for 6 hours and hadn't seen a single sign of the outside world. No power lines, no cell towers, no other vehicles. Even worse, the forest itself seemed to be changing. The trees looked the same species, but their arrangement felt different, like someone was rearranging a familiar room while I wasn't looking. Then I made the discovery that broke my understanding of reality. Following what my compass insisted was a due north bearing back toward the highway, I came around a familiar bend and saw my campsite. The clearing, the creek, even my tent still set up exactly as I'd left it Tuesday morning, except I had packed it. I distinctly remembered folding it, carrying it to my car, loading it in the trunk, but there it was. Same blue dome tent, same spot by the water, guy lines staked with the exact knots my father had taught me. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine running, staring at what had to be my campsite but absolutely could not be my campsite. Finally, I got out and walked over to the tent. Same brand, same model, and when I unzipped the door, my sleeping bag was laid out inside with the same wrinkle pattern I remembered from Tuesday morning. This was when I first understood I wasn't dealing with ordinary wilderness navigation problems. Thursday morning, or what my watch claimed was Thursday morning, though the sunlight felt wrong again, I woke up inside the tent with no memory of deciding to sleep there. My car was parked exactly where I'd left it, but the gas gauge now read full. That was impossible. I'd been running on fumes the night before. I checked my phone for the date and time. It showed Saturday, September 14th, the day I'd originally arrived. But that was 5 days ago. I'd been here for nearly a week. I turned the phone off and back on. Now it showed Tuesday, September 17th. Off and on again. Friday, September 20th. One more time, March 3rd, 2025. My watch had stopped entirely, hands frozen at 3:17. I couldn't remember when that had happened, or even what day it had stopped. Time itself seemed to be malfunctioning in this place. The weirdness escalated throughout what I'll call Thursday, since my phone couldn't agree on what day it actually was. I tried hiking out on foot, leaving the car behind and following the creek downstream. Water always leads to civilization. Eventually, that's basic wilderness survival. I walked for what felt like 8 hours, carefully marking my path with strips torn from a flannel shirt, maintaining a steady pace downstream. As the sun was setting, or maybe rising, the light quality was impossible to read. I found myself approaching a familiar clearing from the opposite direction I'd started walking. My campsite, with my tent, approached from the south instead of the north. The fabric strips I'd been using as trail markers were gone, like they'd never existed. The food situation became genuinely disturbing. I'd packed enough supplies for 3 days, but no matter how much I ate, my cooler stayed at the same level. Every morning, I'd wake up to find the same can of beans, the same granola bars, the same half-empty bottle of water. like my supplies were resetting overnight along with everything else. I started keeping detailed journals, documenting every anomaly, every impossible thing that happened. But every morning the pages would be blank again, no matter what I'd written the day before. I tried hiding pages in different locations around the campsite. They'd vanish overnight, leaving no trace they'd ever existed. Days began blending together until the concept of sequential time became meaningless. I'd wake up, sometimes feeling like I'd slept for hours, sometimes like I'd just closed my eyes, and have no idea if it was morning or afternoon or even the same day. The sun's position gave no reliable clues. Sometimes it would be high overhead at what felt like dawn, sometimes setting at what should have been midday. But the worst discovery was that I was becoming invisible to the outside world. I'd see other hikers occasionally, passing through the area on trails I couldn't locate. Day hikers with expensive gear, backpackers with week-long loads, even what looked like a family with small children. I'd run toward them, shouting, waving my arms, even throwing rocks to get their attention. They'd walk right past like I wasn't there, like I'd become a ghost haunting my own campsite. One afternoon, or morning, or evening, time had lost all meaning. I saw a search and rescue team pass within 50 yards of my tent. Orange shirts, radios crackling, dogs on leashes. They were clearly looking for someone. I screamed until my throat was raw, jumped up and down, even ran directly at the lead searcher. He walked right through me like I was made of air. That's when I understood the true horror of my situation. I wasn't just lost in space, I was lost in time. Somehow, this clearing existed outside normal reality's flow, and I'd become trapped here like an insect in amber. The campsite was my own personal purgatory, an endless loop of the same peaceful weekend that had become an eternal prison. I stopped trying to escape after that. What was the point? Every road led back to the same clearing. Every hike returned to the same tent. Every morning reset to the same impossible supplies and blank journal pages. I developed a routine, reading the same Stephen King novel, though I never seemed to progress beyond page 127. Fishing in the creek, never catching anything but somehow not caring. Writing in journals that would be erased by morning. The peace I'd come here seeking became a torment. Perfect silence, perfect solitude, perfect weather, forever. No challenges, no growth, no change, just existence without progression, like being buried alive in paradise. I started to forget my life before the forest. My apartment in Charlotte, my co-workers, my manager, who was probably furious that I'd never come back from my car trouble. They felt like characters from a movie I'd seen long ago. The only real things were the tent, the creek, and the growing certainty that I would spend eternity reading the same page of the same book. Weeks passed, or maybe years. Time had no meaning when every day was identical. I aged without aging, lived without living, existed in a state of suspended animation that was more terrifying than death, because at least death would be change. Then, one morning, I woke up choking on plastic tubing. Hospital room, fluorescent lights, a nurse adjusting an IV drip, the sounds of machines beeping, people talking in hallways, life continuing in linear time like it was supposed to. The doctor said I'd been found by search and rescue after being missing for 4 days. Severe dehydration, mild hypothermia, found unconscious beside Turtle Creek, mumbling about time loops and invisible people. Classic symptoms of acute wilderness psychosis brought on by isolation and dehydration. They had medications for this. Therapy programs. Rational explanations that made everyone feel better. But I know what I experienced. I lived in that temporal trap for months, maybe years. I felt every day of that endless repetition, every morning of waking up to blank journal pages and impossible supply refills. The doctor showed me my phone's GPS tracking history. It confirmed I'd only been missing 4 days, never straying more than a half-mile from my original campsite. But those 4 days contained eternities. I've never been camping since. Never even driven through mountain country. I quit both jobs and moved to a city apartment where I can see streetlights and hear traffic 24 hours a day. The constant noise and light reassure me that time is moving forward, that reality is functioning normally, that I haven't slipped back into that placeless, timeless clearing where nothing ever changes. But sometimes, late at night, when the city gets as quiet as it ever does, I can still hear that creek running over stones. and I'll catch myself checking my phone's clock obsessively, making sure the numbers keep changing, making sure time keeps moving forward the way it's supposed to. Because part of me never left that clearing. Part of me is still there, trapped in an eternal camping trip, reading page 127 of Pet Sematary for the 10,000th time, living the same peaceful day forever and ever, while the rest of reality continues without me. The worst part isn't that it happened. The worst part is how much I miss it. Sometimes, when work gets stressful or bills pile up, or life feels particularly meaningless, I remember that perfect peace. That complete absence of responsibility, or consequence, or change, and for just a moment, I want to go back. That's the real horror. Not that I escaped from hell, but that I escaped from a prison I'd built out of my own deepest wish. A place where I never had to grow up, never had to face the future, never had to do anything but exist in an eternal present moment of absolute peace. I've started therapy, partly because everyone expects me to after my episode, but mostly because I need help distinguishing between what I want and what would destroy me. Because that clearing is still out there, somewhere in the mountains where time doesn't work right and lost hikers become permanent residents of their own perfect moments. And if I'm being honest, if things get bad enough, I know exactly how to find it again. My name's Jessica Rivera, and I was 28 when I learned why the old-timers in these mountains warn you to never camp alone. I'd been managing Rosie's Diner in Richmond for 3 years, working doubles most weeks, barely seeing sunlight except through grease-stained windows. When my boyfriend Marcus decided our 4-year relationship was holding him back from his potential and moved out while I was pulling a 16-hour shift, I knew I needed to get away from everything for a while. My grandmother used to tell stories about the hollers back in West Virginia, places where the mountains themselves watched you. Some things in them woods, been here longer than us. She'd whisper when I was little, they got their own rules, their own hunger. I always thought she was just trying to scare me into staying close to home. Now I know she was trying to warn me. I found this campground online called Whispering Pines, tucked way back in the Blue Ridge Mountains near a place called Bone Hollow. The reviews were mostly good, though a few mentioned strange sounds at night and feeling watched. I figured that was just city people getting spooked by normal forest noises. After years of Richmond traffic and restaurant drama, the idea of strange sounds actually appealed to me. The drive up was beautiful in that October way that makes you understand why people write poetry about dying leaves. But as I got deeper into the mountains, I started noticing things that didn't quite sit right. Road signs that pointed to towns that didn't appear on my GPS. Billboards for businesses that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. And the radio kept cutting in and out, picking up fragments of what sounded like old-time mountain music, mixed with voices speaking in dialects I couldn't quite place. Whispering Pines sat at the end of a winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. The office was just a little wooden shack with a hand-painted sign, and the woman behind the counter looked like she'd stepped out of a 1,950 seconds photograph. Her name tag said Dottie, and she had these pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You camping alone, honey?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that made me hesitate before answering. "Yes, ma'am. Just need some quiet time to think." Dottie studied me for a long moment, then pulled out an old ledger book instead of using the computer on her desk. "Site 13 should suit you just fine," she said, writing my information in careful cursive. "Gets real peaceful back there. Most folks find exactly what they're looking for." The way she said it made my skin crawl a little, but I chalked it up to mountain eccentricity and took the hand-drawn map she offered. Site 13 was perfect. Tucked back in a grove of ancient hemlocks, far enough from the main campground that I couldn't hear other campers. The silence was so complete it felt like stepping into a church. I set up my tent as the sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove, and opened a bottle of wine. For the first time since Marcus left, I felt like I could actually breathe. That first night, I slept deeper than I had in months. No car horns, no sirens, no upstairs neighbors stomping around. Just the kind of profound quiet that makes you realize how much noise you live with in the city. I woke up Saturday morning feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. It was around 9 when I first heard the humming. Not the electronic beeping from the original story, but something much more unsettling. A low, melodic humming that sounded almost human, but not quite. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, drifting through the trees like smoke. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and completely unfamiliar, yet somehow it felt like something I'd heard before in dreams. At first, I thought it might be another camper, maybe someone doing morning meditation or just enjoying the acoustics of the forest. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voice, if it was a voice, was sustaining notes far longer than any human could manage. And there was something underneath the melody, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match my heartbeat. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, leaving the marked trails and pushing through thick undergrowth. The hemlock forest gradually gave way to older trees, massive oaks and chestnuts that looked like they'd been growing since before Europeans set foot in these mountains. The humming grew stronger as I walked, and I began to notice other sounds layering underneath it. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize, the soft sound of footsteps that stopped whenever I stopped. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I found the source. In a clearing surrounded by ancient trees stood a circle of smooth stones, each about waist high and covered in symbols that looked like they'd been carved by hand. In the center of the circle was a depression in the earth, perfectly round and so deep I couldn't see the bottom. The humming was coming from the hole. As I approached the stone circle, the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and walk away. But there was something hypnotic about those carved stones, something that made me want to get closer and see what was down in that hole. I knelt at the edge of the depression and looked down. The walls were smooth stone, disappearing into blackness below. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to see shapes moving in the depths, pale, writhing forms that might have been roots or might have been something else entirely. That's when I heard my name. Jessica. The voice came from the hole, soft and sweet like my grandmother's voice when she used to sing me lullabies. Jessica, come closer. I leaned forward, drawn by that familiar voice, and that's when I saw her, or thought I saw her. My grandmother's face, looking up at me from impossible depths, her mouth moving in silent words. She looked exactly as she had when I was 7 years old, before the cancer took her, before she became bedridden and hollow-eyed. Come home, baby girl, the voice whispered. Come home to us. I was reaching toward the hole before I realized what I was doing, my hands stretching out toward that beloved face in the darkness. It was only when my fingers touched empty air that the spell broke and I jerked backward, heart pounding. The face in the hole wasn't my grandmother anymore. It was something else wearing her features, something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The thing smiled at me with my grandmother's mouth, and when it spoke again, the voice was layered with harmonics that made my bones ache. Soon, it whispered. Very soon. I ran, crashed through the underbrush like a spooked deer, branches tearing at my clothes and face. I didn't stop running until I reached my campsite, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me through the trees. That night, the humming started again, just after sunset. But this time, it wasn't coming from the direction of the stone circle. It was coming from all around my campsite, a chorus of voices harmonizing in that same impossible melody. And mixed in with the humming were other sounds, footsteps circling my tent, whispers in that strange language, and occasionally, the sound of my name being called in voices I recognized but couldn't place. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe there was some kind of acoustic phenomenon in that clearing, a natural resonance that created auditory hallucinations. Maybe the stress of my breakup and the isolation of camping alone had triggered some kind of breakdown. But when I closed my eyes, I could still see that thing wearing my grandmother's face, and I knew in my bones that whatever I'd encountered wasn't natural. Sunday morning, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and headed for the campground office. I needed to get out of there, but I also felt compelled to warn Dottie about what I'd found. Maybe other campers had reported similar experiences, but when I reached the office, it was abandoned. The door was unlocked and swinging in the breeze, and the inside looked like it had been empty for years. Dust covered everything, spiderwebs filled the corners, and the old ledger book where Dottie had written my information was nowhere to be found. I checked my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. There had been 2 bars when I'd arrived Friday afternoon, but now the phone showed nothing, not even emergency service availability. My car wouldn't start. The engine would turn over but immediately die, like something was choking off the fuel. I popped the hood and found something that made my blood freeze. Someone had carved those same symbols from the stone circle into my battery casing. The metal was still warm to the touch, as if the carving had been done recently. That's when I heard the humming again, coming from the woods around the office. But this time, I could make out words in the melody. They were singing my name over and over in that harmony of impossible voices. I grabbed my backpack and started walking toward the main road, figuring it was about 5 miles to the nearest town. But as I walked, I began to notice that the landscape wasn't matching my memory of the drive-in. Roads that should have been there were missing. The highway markers pointed to towns I'd never heard of. And everywhere I went, those symbols were carved into trees, scratched into road signs, painted on abandoned buildings. The worst part was the people I started encountering as I got closer to what should have been civilization. They looked normal enough from a distance, but as they got closer, something was wrong with their faces. Their features were slightly too symmetrical, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright, and when they spoke, it was in that same harmonic voice I'd heard from the hole. "Going somewhere, Jessica?" asked a man at a gas station that shouldn't have existed. His face was a perfect blend of every man I'd ever known. A little bit Marcus, a little bit my father, a little bit my high school boyfriend. "You should stay. We've been waiting for you." I ran again, this time down a side road that led deeper into the mountains. But no matter which direction I went, I kept encountering more of them. A woman who looked like my mother but wrong. A child who looked like me at age 10 but with teeth like broken glass. They all knew my name, all spoke in those impossible voices, all invited me to stay. As night fell, I found myself back at the stone circle. I hadn't meant to return there. I'd been trying to find the main highway, but somehow every path led back to that clearing with its ancient stones and that hungry hole in the ground. The humming was louder now, a symphony of voices rising from the depths. And I could see them clearly now, the things that lived down there. They weren't wearing familiar faces anymore. They were showing me what they really were. Pale, elongated forms with too many joints, mouths full of needle teeth, eyes like black stars. Beautiful and terrible and completely inhuman. "Join us, Jessica," they sang. "Join our chorus. Add your voice to ours." I understood then what had happened to the other campers, the ones who had checked out and never made it home. This place wasn't just a campground, it was a feeding ground. The things in the hole sustained themselves on human voices, human consciousness, human souls. They lured people in with familiar faces and voices, then drew them down into that darkness where they would sing forever. But I also understood something else. My grandmother's stories about the mountains hadn't been folklore, they'd been warnings passed down from people who'd survived encounters like this. And she'd taught me more than just scary stories. She'd taught me the old songs, the protective melodies that mountain people had used for generations to ward off things that shouldn't exist. I started singing, not their hypnotic humming, but an old hymn my grandmother had taught me when I was little. "Shall we gather at the river?" I sang, my voice shaking but clear. The beautiful river." The humming stopped immediately. The pale things in the hole recoiled as if burned, their harmonies dissolving into discordant shrieks. I kept singing as I backed away from the circle, putting the ancient words between me and whatever lived in that darkness. "Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God." The symbols on the stones began to glow with a sickly light, then crack and crumble. The trees around the clearing withered and fell. The hole itself began to collapse, folding in on itself like reality was healing a wound. I sang my way through the forest, following the melody like a path. Every time I faltered, the humming would start up again behind me, urging me to stop, to turn around, to add my voice to theirs. But I kept singing my grandmother's hymns until I reached a road that looked real, that led to a town with normal people who didn't know my name. The sheriff who found me wandering along Highway 60 said I'd been missing for 4 days, though I only remembered 2. They found my car in the parking lot of a motel 60 miles away, with no explanation for how it had gotten there. The Whispering Pines campground wasn't in any official records. The land where I thought it had been was listed as privately owned wilderness, uninhabited for decades. But sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains and the radio cuts out, I can still hear them singing, still calling my name in harmonies that shouldn't be possible, and I know they're still down there in their hole, waiting for the next lonely soul to follow their melody into the dark. I moved back home to stay with my parents after that. I couldn't handle being alone anymore, especially not in quiet places. My family thinks I had a breakdown after my relationship ended, and maybe that's partly true. But I know what I experienced in those mountains. I know what's still out there, humming in the dark, wearing the faces of everyone we've ever loved. I don't camp anymore. Hell, I barely go outside after sunset, and I teach my grandmother's songs to anyone who'll listen, because you never know when you might need something older and stronger than whatever's calling your name from the shadows. The mountains remember everything, and some things that remember us aren't human at all. I'm Angela, 31, and I work the ICU at University Hospital in Louisville. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, but I still wake up some nights hearing my own voice calling to me from places I've never been. It started when my friend Sarah texted our old nursing school group chat. We'd all scattered after graduation, Sarah doing pediatrics in Lexington, Michelle in emergency medicine up in Cincinnati, Diana working trauma ICU down in Nashville. 2 years of 12-hour shifts and barely keeping our heads above water had turned our tight group into occasional birthday texts and liked Instagram posts. Girls trip, Daniel Boone National Forest. No phones, no drama, just us. Sarah had already picked the spot, a primitive camping area deep in the Kentucky mountains where cell towers couldn't reach, and the nearest road was a 30-minute hike through old-growth forest. The drive down from Louisville took me through country I'd never seen before. Real Appalachian wilderness, where the mountains fold into each other like sleeping giants and the trees grow thick enough to swallow sound. My GPS lost signal 15 miles before the turnoff, leaving me following Sarah's hand-drawn map down progressively smaller roads until I was bouncing along a gravel track that barely qualified as one lane. The camping area was a small clearing carved out of forest that felt older than anything I'd ever seen. Trees so massive I couldn't wrap my arms around them, their canopy so dense that even in broad daylight, everything had a green, underwater quality. Sarah, Michelle, and Diana were already there. Their tents set up in a rough triangle around a stone fire ring that looked like it had been built by the CCC back in the 1932. Seeing them again felt like coming home. Sarah still had that infectious energy that had gotten us through pharmacology exams. Michelle looked more confident now, the kind of sharp-eyed competence you develop in emergency medicine. Diana was quieter, but working trauma ICU will do that. You learn to read people quickly and speak carefully. We set up my tent to complete the square and built a fire as the sun started dropping behind the mountains. That first night was perfect. Wine from Sarah's cooler, stories about the worst doctors we'd dealt with, gossip about classmates who'd already burned out and switched careers. Michelle told us about the patient who'd tried to perform surgery on himself after watching YouTube videos. Diana described holding the hand of a car accident victim while his family said goodbye. Sarah talked about being the one to tell parents their child had cancer. We were all different people than we'd been in school. Harder in some ways, but with a bone-deep understanding of what mattered. The fire crackled, the wine made everything funnier than it should have been, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. I woke up Saturday morning to Diana shaking my tent. "You've got to see this sunrise," she whispered. The mountains were painted in layers of pink and gold, mist rising from valleys so deep they looked bottomless. We made coffee on Sarah's camping stove and planned our day. A 5-mile loop trail that supposedly led to an overlook with views clear to Tennessee. The trail started easy, winding through forest floor carpeted with decades of fallen leaves. The trees here were enormous, ancient oaks and maples that had been growing when Kentucky was still a frontier territory. Everything smelled like earth and decomposition and something else, something wild and green that I couldn't name. 2 miles in, the trail started climbing seriously. The trees grew closer together, blocking out more of the sky. We were laughing and catching up, not paying enough attention to our footing. That's how Michelle caught her foot on a root hidden under the leaves. She went down hard, her ankle twisting with a sound like breaking kindling. We all rushed over. One look told us it was bad, not broken, but swollen, and already turning purple. Michelle tried to stand and immediately sat back down, swearing creatively. You guys need to go back for the first aid kit, she said through gritted teeth. I've got anti-inflammatories back at camp, and we need to get this wrapped properly. Sarah and Diana were the fastest hikers. They could make the round trip in under an hour if they moved fast. I volunteered to stay with Michelle. Partly because my hiking boots were giving me blisters, partly because none of us wanted her sitting alone in these woods with a bad ankle. Our tops, Sarah promised, already shouldering her day pack. We'll bring everything: ibuprofen, elastic bandage, ice packs from the cooler. Diana squeezed my shoulder. Keep her off the ankle. We'll be back before you know it. I watched them disappear around a bend in the trail, their voices fading into the forest sounds. Michelle and I settled in to wait. She propped her foot up on my pack, and we shared a water bottle while she tried not to wince every time she moved. The woods were peaceful in that deep, heavy way old forests get. Birds calling in the canopy, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or chipmunk. We talked about random things, comparing horror stories from our different hospitals, gossip about people from school we'd lost touch with, normal stuff. 23 minutes later, we heard Sarah's voice. It came from deeper in the forest, off to our left where no trail existed. Angela, we need help over here. Her voice carried that edge of panic I'd heard in the ICU when a patient was crashing. Michelle and I looked at each other. Sarah? I called back. Where are you? Over here, hurry. The voice was definitely coming from the woods. Maybe 100 yards off the trail, through trees so thick I couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. I helped Michelle to her feet. Maybe they found a shortcut back to camp, I said, though that didn't make sense. Or maybe Diana got hurt too. We started making our way toward Sarah's voice, me supporting most of Michelle's weight as we picked through the underbrush. The forest floor was treacherous. Fallen logs hidden under leaves, holes between roots that could twist an ankle, thorny vines that caught our clothes. Sarah, I called out every few steps, keep talking so we can find you. This way. Hurry. The response always came from just ahead of us, just out of sight through the trees. After 10 minutes of struggling through the undergrowth, I was starting to get worried. We should have found them by now, or at least gotten close enough to see them. The voice kept leading us deeper into trackless forest, always staying just ahead. I need to rest, Michelle panted. We found a massive oak she could lean against while catching her breath. That's when we heard Diana's voice, coming from a completely different direction. Sarah's hurt, she fell in a ravine. Diana sounded terrified, which wasn't like her. In 3 years of nursing school and 2 years of trauma work, I'd never heard Diana panic, but her voice was coming from at least 100 yards to our right, completely opposite from where we'd been hearing Sarah. Diana, I shouted. Where are you? We can't see you. This way. Follow my voice. I stared at Michelle, who was looking into the forest with growing alarm. How did they get so far apart? She whispered. That's when it clicked. We'd been following Sarah's voice for 15 minutes, crashing through forest thick enough that we could barely see 20 feet ahead. If Sarah had really been that close, we should have found her by now. And if Diana was hurt enough to fall in a ravine, how was she calling to us from the opposite direction? Stay right here, I told Michelle. But as soon as I said it, both voices started calling at once. Angela, we're coming to get you. Sarah's voice from the north. Don't move, we can see you. Diana's voice from the south. Michelle grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. Those are coming from opposite directions, she whispered. That's impossible. We stood frozen, listening as both voices continued, calling to us with completely contradictory instructions. Sarah was telling us to come toward her. Diana was telling us to stay put. Both voices sounded exactly like our friends, but the things they were saying couldn't both be true. Then it got worse. More voices joined in, multiple Sarahs calling from different parts of the forest, 3 or 4 Dianas, all saying different things. The voices began overlapping, creating a chorus of our friends' voices echoing through the trees from every direction. Angela, we need help over here. Michelle, can you walk? This way. No, this way. We found the trail. We're lost. Hurry. Stay there. Michelle was shaking now. Listen to how they're talking, she said quietly. Really listen. She was right. The voices sounded like Sarah and Diana, but there was something subtly wrong with the speech patterns. Like hearing a recording of someone trying to imitate your friends. The pitch was right, the basic vocal characteristics were right, but the rhythm and inflection were just slightly off. Then the voices turned cruel. "Angela, remember that patient you let die because you were too slow with the crash cart?" That was Sarah's voice, sweet and conversational, but Sarah would never say something like that, ever. And the incident it was referring to, a code blue I'd been too late getting to during my first month, was something I'd never told anyone about. "Michelle, your mom called your hospital looking for you yesterday. She thinks you're using again." Diana's voice now, calm and matter-of-fact. But Michelle's mother had been dead for 6 years, and Michelle had never had a drug problem. The voices knew things about us, personal details that only we should know, but they were twisting those details into lies designed to hurt. It was like something had been listening to our conversations, learning about our lives, our fears, our secrets, and was now weaponizing that knowledge against us. "We have to get back to the trail," I said. "Right now." But as soon as I said that, the voices multiplied. Dozens of them now, all sounding like Sarah and Diana, but saying horrible things. They knew about Michelle's anxiety attacks during nursing school. They knew about Diana's divorce. They knew about the depression that had almost made me drop out junior year. And they were using every piece of personal information like a scalpel, cutting at our insecurities and fears. We started moving as quietly as possible, me supporting Michelle as we tried to retrace our steps through the underbrush. But the voices followed us, seeming to come from the trees themselves. Sometimes they'd repeat fragments of conversations we'd had the night before around the campfire, but twisted and wrong. Other times they'd say things that sounded like our friends, but contained information that wasn't true. The worst part was how patient they sounded. Like whatever was making those voices had all the time in the world to lead us deeper into the forest, to pick apart our friendship and our sanity piece by piece. It took us nearly an hour to find the trail again. When we finally stumbled back onto the packed dirt path, my shirt was torn from thorns, and Michelle was limping worse than ever. But there, sitting exactly where we'd left them, were Sarah and Diana with the first aid kit spread out between them. "There you are," Sarah said, jumping up when she saw us. "We've been waiting forever. Where did you go?" I stared at her, trying to process what I was seeing. "We've been following your voices for the past hour. You were calling for help." Sarah and Diana exchanged confused looks. "We never called for help," Diana said slowly. "We went straight back to camp, got the supplies, and came straight back here. We've been sitting here for maybe 20 minutes. We never left the trail," Sarah added. "And we haven't said a word to each other, except to check what supplies we had." Michelle collapsed onto a fallen log, exhausted and shaken. "But we heard you, both of you, calling from the forest." I tried to explain what had happened, the voices leading us in circles, the contradictory directions, the cruel personal attacks. Both Sarah and Diana just looked more confused and concerned. "We would never say things like that to you," Diana said quietly. "You know that, right?" That's when we heard it. From deep in the forest behind us came our own voices, clear as day, having the exact conversation we'd just finished. "There you are. We've been waiting forever. Where did you go? We've been following your voices for the past hour. You were calling for help. We never called for help." Our conversation played back to us, word for word, in our exact voices, but coming from empty forest. The four of us went dead silent, listening to ourselves talk. But it wasn't just a recording. The voices had the same intonations, the same emotional undertones, even the same slight echo from the clearing we were standing in. "Pack everything," Sarah whispered. "Right now." We half-carried Michelle back to camp and threw our gear into our cars with a speed that would have impressed our old drill sergeant nursing instructor. The whole time, fragments of our conversations drifted out of the forest around us. Not just from that day, but from the night before. Our voices discussing work, family, relationships, all perfectly reproduced but coming from trees and shadows. As we loaded the last of our gear, I heard my own voice coming from the forest, clear as if I was standing next to myself. The woods were peaceful in that deep, heavy way old forests get. That was something I'd thought to myself earlier, while we were waiting for Sarah and Diana to get back. I'd never said it out loud. We drove away in convoy, Sarah leading since she knew the roads best. In my rearview mirror, I could see the forest growing smaller, but I swear I could still hear our voices echoing from the trees, getting fainter but never quite disappearing. None of us talked much on the drive home. What was there to say? That something in those mountains had learned our voices perfectly and used them to hunt us? That it knew things about our lives we'd never shared with anyone? I did some research when I got back to Louisville. The Daniel Boone National Forest sits on land that was sacred to the Cherokee long before white settlers arrived. There are stories in the old records about voice thieves, spirits that could perfectly mimic human speech to lure people off safe paths. Families would hear deceased relatives calling to them from the forest. Children would follow their parents' voices deeper and deeper into the woods until they disappeared entirely. The Park Service has records going back to the 1,940 seconds of people reporting voices calling to them from empty forest. Hikers who followed familiar voices off marked trails and were found days later, dehydrated and disoriented, with no memory of how they'd gotten so far from where they started. A few were never found at all. We've stayed close since that weekend, but we've never gone camping together again. Sometimes, one of us will text the group asking if anyone else has been having dreams about voices calling their name. We all have them. I still work the ICU, still live in Louisville, but I don't hike alone anymore, and I pay careful attention to voices calling from empty spaces. Because I've learned that just because something sounds exactly like someone you trust, doesn't mean you should follow it into the dark. And sometimes, late at night when I'm walking to my car after a shift, I hear my own voice calling to me from dark places. It knows my name, knows my fears, knows exactly what to say to make me want to follow it. But I never do, because I remember that patient hunger in those voices in the forest, the way they seem to feed on our confusion and fear. Whatever lives in those mountains is still out there, still learning, still calling to people with voices that sound like home. And it's getting better at it. I was 31 when I finally got to see my 3 best friends from nursing school again. We'd all graduated together from VCU 5 years earlier, but life had a way of scattering people to different hospitals across Virginia. Sarah ended up in Richmond, Michelle got a job down in Norfolk, Diana moved out to Roanoke, and I stayed in the northern suburbs working at a trauma center. We'd been texting about doing a reunion for months, and finally Sarah suggested camping, something we used to do all the time in college, but hadn't done since we got our licenses and started working crazy hospital shifts. I remember being excited about it in a way I hadn't felt in years. Working as a nurse, especially in trauma, you see so much pain and chaos that you start forgetting there's a world outside those sterile halls. The idea of sitting around a campfire with my girls, drinking wine and catching up on 5 years of life, sounded like exactly what I needed. Plus, Diana had found this perfect spot through her boyfriend who worked for the Forest Service, a backcountry site up in the mountains near the West Virginia border. No crowds, no RV hookups, just us in the woods. We planned to meet there on a Friday afternoon in late October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the weather was supposed to be perfect. Cool nights, warm days. I loaded up my Honda with camping gear I hadn't touched since college and drove the 3 hours west into the mountains. The further I got from the interstate, the more I could feel the stress leaving my shoulders. Cell service got spotty once I hit the mountain roads, which was fine by me. I was ready to disconnect. Finding the campsite took longer than expected. Diana's directions were good, but the last mile was on a dirt forest road that my car wasn't really built for. I had to go slow over the ruts and rocks, hoping I wouldn't tear up my oil pan. When I finally pulled into the clearing, I could see why Diana had picked this spot. It was a flat area surrounded by tall oaks and maples, with a fire ring someone had built years ago and a weathered picnic table, perfect for 4 women who just wanted to catch up away from everything. The only weird thing was the radio tower. It stood about a quarter-mile away, rising up through the trees like a giant metal skeleton. Diana had mentioned it in her texts, said it was an old Forest Service communications tower that had been abandoned for years. From where we were camped, you could see the top of it poking up above the tree line, with some kind of equipment still mounted up there. Satellite dishes and antenna arrays that looked pretty sophisticated for something that was supposedly decommissioned. Sarah arrived about 20 minutes after me, followed by Michelle and then Diana. It was like stepping back in time. We fell right back into our old dynamic, talking over each other and laughing at inside jokes from nursing school. Sarah looked exactly the same, still tiny and energetic with her short blonde hair. Michelle had gained some weight but seemed happier than I remembered her being in college. Diana had cut her dark hair into a bob that made her look more professional, more grown-up. We spent Friday evening doing exactly what I'd hoped, sitting around the fire, sharing stories from our different hospitals, complaining about difficult doctors and crazy patients. Michelle brought really good wine, the expensive kind we never could have afforded as students. Sarah had made s'mores supplies. Diana, always the organized one, had brought camp chairs and a portable table. By midnight, we were all pleasantly drunk and happy, catching up on 5 years of life changes, relationships, career moves. I fell asleep in my tent that night, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The mountain air was cool and clean, and the only sounds were the usual forest noises, wind in the trees, an occasional owl. I remember thinking how great it was to be away from the constant beeping and alarms of the hospital, away from the smell of antiseptic and the fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly. I woke up Saturday morning to a sound I'd never heard before. At first I thought it might be some kind of equipment, maybe a generator running somewhere nearby, or construction machinery. But as I lay there listening, I realized it wasn't mechanical. It was more like a very low humming, so deep I felt it more than heard it. The vibration seemed to come up through the ground and settle in my chest, making my ribs resonate slightly. When I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the humming was clearer. It had this weird quality where you couldn't quite pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to surround you. The other girls were already up, standing around looking confused. "You guys hear that too?" Sarah asked, pressing her hand to her chest. "It's like it's inside me." Michelle nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Makes my teeth ache." "What the hell is that?" We all turned to look at the radio tower. The equipment at the top was clearly active, red lights blinking in some kind of sequence, and I could see one of the satellite dishes slowly rotating. Diana walked a few steps toward it, squinting up at the machinery. "I thought you said that thing was abandoned," I said. "It is," Diana replied, but she sounded uncertain. "At least, that's what Jake told me. He said the Forest Service stopped using it in the 90 seconds. The humming continued all through breakfast, this constant low-frequency vibration that you couldn't ignore once you noticed it. We joked about it at first. Sarah said maybe we'd get better cell reception camping next to a radio tower, even if it was supposedly dead. But as the morning went on, the sound seemed to get slightly louder, or maybe we were just becoming more aware of it. By mid-morning, Sarah started complaining about a headache. She was always prone to migraines, so none of us thought much of it at first. She took some ibuprofen and lay down in her tent for a while, but when she came back out around 11, she looked pale and shaky. "It's getting worse," she said, squinting even though we were sitting in shade. "And that humming is driving me crazy." Michelle was having problems too. She'd gotten a nosebleed around 10 that morning, just suddenly started bleeding while we were sitting around talking. But instead of the bright red blood you'd expect, it was dark, almost brownish. As a nurse, I knew that usually meant old blood, but this was coming from her nose, fresh, and it wouldn't stop. She went through half a pack of tissues before it finally slowed down. "This is weird," I told her, examining the tissues. "You hit your nose on something?" "No," she said, dabbing at her nostrils. "Just started bleeding out of nowhere." The strangest thing was Diana, though. She'd always been the sharpest of all of us, got the highest grades in nursing school, could remember drug interactions and dosages like a computer. But Saturday afternoon, she started having trouble with words. Simple things. She'd start to say something and then stop, looking confused. "Can you hand me that?" "That," she said, pointing at her water bottle. "Water bottle," I said. "Right. Water bottle." She shook her head like she was trying to clear it. "Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me today." I was starting to feel uneasy. As nurses, we were all trained to recognize symptoms, and what I was seeing in my friends looked neurological. Sarah's worsening headache, Michelle's abnormal bleeding, Diana's word-finding problems, they could all point to increased intracranial pressure. But that didn't make sense unless they'd all been exposed to something. The humming from the tower kept getting louder as the day went on. By late afternoon, it wasn't just a vibration you felt in your chest anymore. It was an actual audible sound, a high-pitched whine underneath the low rumble. And the tower equipment was definitely more active. The red lights were blinking faster, and I could see multiple satellite dishes moving now, tracking across the sky like they were following something. Saturday evening was when I really started to worry. My friends had changed. Not just their symptoms, but their behavior. Instead of sitting around the fire talking like we had the night before, they were all staring at the radio tower. Just sitting there, looking up at it through the trees, barely speaking. "Hey," I said, trying to get their attention. "Who wants to play cards?" No response. They were all facing the same direction, looking toward that tower with blank expressions. When I waved my hand in front of Sarah's face, she blinked and looked at me like she was surprised to see me there. "What?" she said. "I asked if you wanted to play cards." "Oh." She turned back to look at the tower. "We need to stay close. Signal is important." "What signal?" "We have to listen," Michelle said without looking at me. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I felt a chill run down my spine. These weren't my friends anymore. The way they spoke, the monotone delivery, the vacant stares, it was like they'd been sedated, but they were still awake and responsive, just different. "Wrong. Guys, you're scaring me," I said. "Maybe we should pack up and head home." "No," Diana said firmly. "Can't leave. Have to stay close to the signal." That night was the worst night of my life. My friends didn't come to their tents. They just sat there in their camp chairs, facing the tower, all night long. I tried to sleep, but kept checking on them every hour or so. They never moved, never closed their eyes, just sat there staring into the darkness toward that tower, their faces completely blank. The humming was getting painful by then. It felt like it was vibrating inside my skull, making my ears ring. When I pressed my hands against my ears, it didn't help. The sound seemed to come from inside my head. By dawn, my ears had started bleeding. Just a little trickle that I wiped away with tissue. Sunday morning, I woke up to find their chairs empty. I looked around frantically and spotted them walking toward the tower in a line, moving in perfect synchronized steps like soldiers marching. I shouted after them, but they didn't turn around or slow down. I followed them through the woods, my heart pounding. The closer we got to the tower, the worse the humming became. It was like a drill going through my head, making it hard to think clearly. I could feel myself getting drowsy, compliant, like part of me wanted to just follow along with whatever was happening. At the base of the tower, I found something that shouldn't have existed. Hidden behind some bushes and earth was a concrete stairway leading underground. It looked recently excavated, with fresh concrete and modern equipment visible at the entrance. My friends disappeared down those stairs without hesitation. I followed them down into what looked like a high-tech laboratory. The walls were lined with computer equipment, monitors showing brainwave patterns and frequency readings. There were 3 metal chairs in the center of the room, and my friends were sitting in them, wearing strange headband devices that pulsed with the same rhythm as the humming. The devices seemed to be fused to their heads somehow. When I tried to remove Sarah's headband, it wouldn't budge, like it had grown into her skin. Her eyes were open but completely vacant, and she didn't respond when I shook her or called her name. I started reading the computer screens frantically. Files with titles like Behavioral Modification Protocol and Neural Frequency Mapping. Research data, going back to the 1970 seconds, about using specific radio frequencies to influence brain chemistry and to control human behavior. The project was supposed to have been shut down in the 1980 seconds. But clearly someone had been continuing the work. According to the files, the radio tower was broadcasting a precise frequency designed to target specific regions of the brain. Most people would just experience mild discomfort and leave the area. But people with certain neurological patterns, like the pattern shared by many healthcare workers, were more susceptible to the signal's effects. We'd essentially walked into an invisible trap. I realized I was partially affected too. The drowsiness was getting stronger, and part of my mind was telling me to just sit down in the empty 4th chair and let the signal take over. It would be easier than fighting. But seeing my friends like that, empty, hollowed out, turned into programmable drones, gave me the anger I needed to fight back. I grabbed a metal chair and started smashing the computer equipment. Alarms started blaring immediately, and an automated voice announced, "Containment breach in progress. Initiating lockdown protocol." The underground facility began sealing itself. Heavy doors started sliding shut, cutting off escape routes. I grabbed my friends' hands and dragged them toward the stairs, using all my strength to pull their limp bodies up toward the surface. Just as we cleared the underground entrance, the headband devices fell away from their heads, like the signal had been cut. All 3 of them immediately collapsed unconscious, but they were breathing normally. I managed to get them back to our campsite and loaded into my car. The drive to the nearest hospital was the longest 3 hours of my life, checking constantly to make sure they were still breathing. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with them. No head trauma, no signs of drug use, no neurological damage. They'd lost about 24 hours of memory, couldn't remember anything from Saturday morning until they woke up in the hospital Sunday evening. The official diagnosis was unexplained syncope, probably caused by dehydration and altitude. I never told anyone the real story. Who would believe it? Even my friends don't remember what happened. They think we had a great camping trip and are already talking about doing it again next year. Sometimes I catch them staring off into space with that same blank expression, but it only lasts a few seconds before they snap back to normal. I've done some research since then, quietly, carefully. That radio tower is still listed as abandoned in all official records. But I found references to the research program buried in declassified documents. Something called Project Mindbridge that was supposedly terminated in 1987. Supposedly. I don't camp anymore. Don't even like being away from populated areas for too long. And I've developed this habit of testing radio frequencies when I'm somewhere new, just to make sure I'm not walking into another trap. Because now I know that some signals aren't meant to communicate with machines. Sometimes they're meant to reprogram people. I was 41 when my family vanished right in front of me. Not disappeared, vanished. There's a difference, and if you've never experienced it, pray to God you never do. My name's David Martinez. I've been a plumber for 18 years, working the kind of brutal 60-hour weeks that turn your hands into leather and your back into a question mark. My wife Lisa teaches 3rd grade, the kind of woman who stays up until midnight cutting out paper snowflakes for her classroom because she believes every kid deserves magic. Our twins, Emma and Jake, were 8 years old that September. 8 years old and growing up faster than I could keep track of, which is why I finally agreed to Lisa's camping idea. 1 week, she'd begged me for months. Just 1 week where you're not crawling under someone's house and I'm not grading spelling tests. The kids have never even seen the Milky Way, Dave. She had this way of making me feel guilty about providing for our family, but she was right. I was missing their childhood, watching it slip by in 12-hour shifts and emergency weekend calls. Shenandoah seemed safe enough, a real campground with bathhouses and park rangers, not some backwoods survival situation. Lisa spent weeks planning, buying a tent big enough for 4 people, camp chairs that folded into carrying bags, even a special cooler that supposedly kept ice for a week. The kids were bouncing off the walls with excitement, asking me every day if I knew how to make a campfire, if we'd really see bears, if we could catch fish with our bare hands like they'd seen on some nature show. The drive up from Mechanicsville took 3 hours, winding through mountains that seemed to lean closer to the road the deeper we went. By the time we reached the campground, the sun was starting to hang low behind the ridgeline, casting everything in that golden green light that makes the Appalachians look like something from a fairy tale. Our site was number 8, tucked back against the tree line with a clear view across a small valley to the opposite ridge. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The tent instructions might as well have been written in ancient Greek, and Lisa kept correcting my interpretation of insert pole A into grommet B, while the kids ran circles around us, high on mountain air and freedom. But once we had everything in place, tent, camp, kitchen, under a blue tarp, chairs arranged around a ring of blackened stones, it looked like a real home. Temporary, but real. That first night was perfect. We cooked hot dogs on sticks over a fire that took me 4 tries and half a newspaper to get going properly. The kids roasted marshmallows until their faces were sticky with sugar and wood smoke. When full darkness fell, the stars came out like someone had shaken glitter across black velvet. More stars than I'd ever seen from our suburban backyard. Lisa and I sat by the dying coals after the kids crashed in the tent, holding hands like teenagers, talking about dreams we'd put on hold for mortgages and car payments. "This is what they'll remember," Lisa whispered, watching sparks float up toward the Milky Way. Not the house or the stuff. This. I believed her. For one perfect night, I believed her completely. The campground had a gentle rhythm. Most sites were occupied by retirees in RVs or young couples with expensive hiking gear, everyone keeping a polite distance. The camp host, Bill, stopped by Tuesday morning to check on us grizzled old mountain man with knowing eyes who'd been working these hills for 30 years. He gave us a hand-drawn map of the best family trails, warned us about a black bear with cubs that had been spotted near the creek, and told us the weather would hold clear through the weekend. "Y'all picked a good time," he said, squinting up at the sky. "Most folks cleared out after Labor Day. You'll have the place mostly to yourselves." He paused, studying our campsite with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Site 8's got a good history, peaceful. Some places in these mountains, well, some places collect trouble. But this one's always been kind to families." I didn't think much about that comment until later. It was Wednesday morning when Lisa first mentioned the family at Site 12. I was rebuilding our fire from last night's ashes, coaxing life back into barely glowing coals, when she came back from the bathroom looking puzzled. "Dave, there's a family over there that looks exactly like us." I glanced up through the morning haze. Site 12 was maybe 50 yards away through a screen of pine trees, and sure enough, there was a family there. Tent, camp chairs, coolers, the basic setup, but I couldn't make out details from this distance. "Lot of families camp, honey. Probably just... no." Her voice had an edge I rarely heard from Lisa. "I mean, they look exactly like us. The woman, she moves like me, same height, same hair, and the kids." She trailed off, staring. I followed her gaze and felt something cold settle in my stomach. 2 children were playing near Site 12's fire ring, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 8, dark hair like our twins. The boy wore a red t-shirt identical to one Jake had packed for this trip. "That's weird," I admitted, but rational explanations were already forming. Maybe distant relatives? You know how these mountain families are, everyone's connected somehow, if you go back far enough. But Lisa wasn't listening. She was watching the other mother hang wet towels on a rope between 2 trees, and her face had gone pale. "That's exactly how my sister Karen hangs laundry. Exactly, the way she shakes each piece twice before pinning it. Karen lives in Dallas. Besides, you haven't talked to her in years." "I know where my sister lives, Dave." Lisa's voice was sharp now, defensive. "But that woman moves like Karen, stands like her, has the same nervous habit of touching her ear when she concentrates." I looked again. The woman was too far away for me to see ear touching. But there was something about her posture, the way she moved through her morning routine, that seemed oddly familiar, like watching a movie you'd seen before but couldn't quite place. Emma and Jake emerged from our tent, hair tousled with sleep, and immediately spotted the other children. "Can we go play with them?" Emma asked, already bouncing on her toes. "Yeah, they look fun," Jake added. "The boy's got a cool stick." Before we could answer, both kids were walking towards Site 12 like they'd been invited. Not running, not hesitant, walking with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. "Kids, get back here," I called, but my voice sounded weak. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the way our twins moved so confidently towards strangers, or the way the other children looked up at exactly the right moment, smiling and waving like they'd been expecting visitors. Lisa followed our kids, and I watched from our fire ring as she approached the other family's campsite. The conversation that followed made my skin crawl, though I couldn't hear a word of it. I could see Lisa's body language, the way she held her shoulders when she was confused, the hand gesture she made when asking questions. The other woman responded with animated familiarity, pointing at our campsite, laughing at something Lisa said, touching Lisa's arm like an old friend would. After 10 minutes, Lisa came back looking like she'd seen a ghost. "Her name is Maria Martinez," she said without preamble. "She knows things about us, Dave. She asked about my classroom, knew I teach 3rd grade at Brookside Elementary. She asked how our bathroom remodel is going." The coffee mug in my hand suddenly felt too heavy. We'd started that remodel 2 weeks ago. Hadn't told anyone except Lisa's mother. "She says we camp here every year," Lisa continued, her voice getting smaller. "She says our kids are best friends, that they've been looking forward to this trip for months." She showed me pictures on her phone, Dave. Pictures of us. Here. Last year, the year before. Pictures I don't remember taking. That's when the other husband walked over. Average height, work boots, flannel shirt, he could have been any guy from my neighborhood. But he walked toward me with the easy confidence of someone approaching an old friend. "Morning, Dave," he called out, grinning. "Kids excited about the fishing trip today?" I stared at him. Something about his face seemed familiar, like someone I'd met once at a party and couldn't quite place. But I was certain I'd never seen him before in my life. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," I said carefully. He laughed, a sound that made my teeth itch. "Come on, man, don't mess around. Maria's got lunch packed, and I brought those new lures I was telling you about, the ones that look like real minnows. I've never talked to you about fishing lures." His grin faltered for just a moment, and in that micro-expression, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, his face went completely blank, like someone had erased his personality and was frantically trying to reload it. Then the smile snapped back into place. "Of course you have," he said. But now his voice had a rehearsed quality, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines and was improvising. "Last year, you said the bass and the creek were too smart for regular lures. I don't fish. I hate fishing." Another blank moment. His eyes went glassy, unfocused, like he was buffering. Then, right, you prefer hiking, the trail up to Black Rock Summit. You said you wanted to show the kids the view this year. I'd never heard of Black Rock Summit, but the way he said it, with such casual certainty, made me doubt my own memory for a second. Maybe Lisa had mentioned some trail she wanted to try? Maybe I'd forgotten a conversation we'd had during the busy weeks of trip planning? "Show him the pictures," Lisa whispered. The man, David, he'd introduced himself as David Martinez, which was impossible because that was my name, pulled out his phone and started swiping through photos. What I saw made my knees weak. Photo after photo of our two families camping together. Not this trip, but others. Years of trips, apparently. Me and the other David gutting fish by the creek. Lisa and Maria laughing around a campfire. All four kids roasting marshmallows together, covered in chocolate and grinning. Emma and Jake playing with the other children like siblings. But here's what made it truly horrible. I looked happy in every single photo, relaxed, genuine, comfortable. These weren't stiff-posed shots with strangers. These were the natural, candid photos of longtime family friends. In one picture, I had my arm around the other David's shoulders, both of us holding up a string of fish and grinning like idiots. In another, Lisa was braiding the other little girl's hair while the children sat in a circle playing some sort of card game. "This is impossible," I whispered. "What do you mean?" the other David asked. And now his voice carried a note of concern that seemed genuine. "Dave, are you feeling all right? You're acting like you've never seen me before." "Because I haven't. I've never seen any of you before." He exchanged a worried glance with Maria, who had walked over during our conversation. Up close, the resemblance to Lisa was uncanny, not identical, but similar enough to be deeply unsettling. Same build, same facial structure, same way of standing, with one hip cocked and arms crossed when worried. "David, honey, you're scaring the children," Maria said gently. "Maybe you need to sit down? You've been working so hard lately." The children, our children and theirs, were playing together about 20 feet away, and I finally got a good look at the other kids. The similarity was beyond coincidence. The boy could have been Jake's identical twin, same dark hair, same gap between his front teeth, same way of throwing rocks with his whole body. The girl was Emma's mirror image down to the small scar on her chin from a playground fall last spring. "Jake," I called, "come here." My son looked up, but so did the other boy. They both started walking toward me at the same time, same gait, same confused expression. "Which one called us?" the other boy asked, and his voice was Jake's voice exactly. I grabbed my Jake, at least. I thought it was my Jake, and pulled him close. "Tell me about our house," I said urgently. "Describe your bedroom." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "It's blue, Dad, with the race car bed, and the poster of sharks on the ceiling." "Why are you being weird?" The other boy nodded along to every detail. "Yeah, same as mine, except my poster has dolphins too." "No," I said firmly. "Your poster just has sharks. No dolphins." "Dad, are you okay?" my Jake asked. "You're acting really strange." But here's the thing that made my world tilt sideways. When I looked down at Jake, really looked at him, I couldn't remember with absolute certainty what his bedroom poster showed. Sharks? Definitely. But were there dolphins too? Had there always been dolphins? Why couldn't I remember something I saw every night when I tucked him in? That night, after we'd managed to extricate ourselves from the impossible conversation and get the kids fed and settled, Lisa and I sat by our fire in shell-shocked silence. Every few minutes, one of us would start to say something, then stop. What was there to say? How do you discuss something that couldn't have happened? Check your phone, Lisa said finally. Look at our camping photos from previous years. I pulled out my phone with hands that trembled slightly. We'd never been camping before this trip. Never. This was our first family camping experience. The reason Lisa had spent weeks planning and shopping and reading camping blogs. But my photo album told a different story. There were albums labeled Shenandoah 2022, Shenandoah 2021, Shenandoah 2020. Hundreds of photos of our family camping at this exact spot, going back years. Photos of the kids when they were younger, 6, 7, 5, but always with the other family. Pictures of me teaching both boys to tie fishing knots. Pictures of Lisa and Maria cooking over camp stoves while 4 children played in the background. In every photo, we looked like we belonged together. Natural, easy, comfortable. Like we'd been doing this forever. I don't remember taking any of these, I whispered. I don't remember being here before at all, Lisa replied. But look at this one. She showed me her phone. A photo from Shenandoah 2020 showing both families around a campfire. The kids were younger, gap-toothed, and sunburned. But what made my stomach clench was the expression on my face in the photo. I was laughing at something, head thrown back, completely relaxed. I looked happier than I'd looked in any real photo from 2020. That was the year I'd been laid off for 3 months. The year we'd nearly lost the house. The year I'd worked 18-hour days just to catch up on bills. But in this impossible photo, I looked like a man without a care in the world. Lisa, I said carefully, what if we're losing our minds? Both of us. What if there's something in the water here, or the altitude? Or, no. Her voice was firm. This is real. Those people are real. The photos are real, but our memories. She trailed off, staring into the fire. What if our memories are the problem? What if we're the ones who are wrong? That possibility was somehow more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. If I couldn't trust my own memory, my own sense of reality, then what was left? Who was I, if not the sum of my experiences, my decisions, my remembered life? Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom facilities near the camp entrance. The path was lit by small solar lights, and the woods around me were alive with the normal sounds of night owls, rustling leaves, the distant call of a loon from the lake. Peaceful sounds, safe sounds. But when I walked back past Site 12, I stopped dead. The campsite was empty. No tent, no truck, no evidence that anyone had been there. The fire ring held only cold ashes that looked days old. The ground where their tent had been was covered in undisturbed pine needles. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight function to search the area carefully. No tire tracks where their vehicle had been parked. No footprints around the fire ring, no tent stakes or rope marks on the trees, nothing. I checked my photo albums again. All the camping photos were gone. Every single one. My phone showed only the photos from our current trip arrival at the campground, setting up the tent, the kids playing by our fire. When I got back to our site, Lisa was awake, sitting in her camp chair and staring across at Site 12. They're gone, she said without looking at me. I know, I checked. There's no sign they were ever there. I called the camp host. Bill says Site 12 has been vacant all week. Says he doesn't know what I'm talking about when I mention another family. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the empty campsite across from us. The woods felt different now, not peaceful, but watchful. Like something in the darkness was studying us, learning us, preparing. The kids, I said suddenly. We need to check on the kids. We crept into the tent as quietly as possible. Emma and Jake were sleeping soundly in their little sleeping bags, faces peaceful and innocent in the dim light from my phone. But when I studied their faces carefully, really looked at them, I felt a spike of panic. Was Emma's nose slightly different? Had Jake's ears always been quite that shape? I couldn't tell. In the blue-white glow of the phone light, my own children looked like strangers. Lisa, I whispered, do they look right to you? She studied their sleeping faces for a long moment. I think so. But I'm not sure. God, Dave, I'm not sure of anything anymore. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the dying fire, taking turns checking on the kids, watching Site 12 for any sign of movement. Every forest sound made us jump. Every shifting shadow could have been someone approaching our camp. By dawn, we were exhausted and paranoid, questioning every memory, every assumption about our lives. Thursday morning brought no relief. The kids woke up normal, asking for pancakes and wondering why we looked so tired. They had no memory of playing with other children the day before. "What other kids?" Emma asked when Lisa carefully probed. "We haven't seen any other kids since we got here. Remember yesterday? You and Jake went to play with the boy and girl at the campsite across from us." Emma shook her head. "Mom, you're being silly. There's nobody else here, just us." Jake nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we've been camping alone the whole time. Can we go to the creek today? I want to look for crawdads." Normal. They were completely, utterly normal, which somehow made it worse. Lisa and I spent the morning in a kind of desperate denial, trying to force the day back into vacation mode. We made pancakes on the camp stove, played cards at the picnic table, took the kids to the creek to hunt for crawdads and smooth stones. For a few hours, it almost worked. The other family felt like a shared nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by our first real vacation in years. But around lunchtime, they came back. I was grilling hamburgers when I heard the sound of a truck engine coming down the campground road. Not unusual, campers arrived and left all day long. But this particular engine sound made my skin crawl. I looked up from the grill and saw a pickup truck pulling into Site 12, identical to mine down to the color and model year. "No," I said under my breath. "No, no, no." But yes. The other family climbed out of the truck like they'd never left, immediately beginning the familiar routine of setting up their campsite. Maria hung towels on the rope between the trees in exactly the same pattern as before. The other David started building a fire using the exact same arrangement of kindling and logs. The children began playing the same game in the same spot near their picnic table. "Hey there," the other David called out, waving cheerfully. "Sorry, we had to run into town for supplies yesterday. You know how it is, always forget something important." I stared at him, hamburger spatula forgotten in my hand. "You were gone. You were completely gone. There was no trace you'd ever been here." He looked confused. "Gone where?" "We just drove into Front Royal for groceries and ice. Took longer than expected. You know how those mountain roads are." "What day is it?" I asked. "Thursday, of course, September 24th. "Why?" But that was wrong. According to my phone, according to every marker I could think of, it was Thursday, September 24th. They hadn't been gone for a day, they'd been gone for one night, from midnight until noon. But they were talking like they'd left Thursday morning and returned Thursday afternoon, losing only a few hours instead of 12. "Dave, you're acting strange again," Maria said, approaching with a concerned smile. "Are you feeling all right? Maybe you need more coffee." The children, all four of them, were playing together again like they'd never been separated. Emma and Jake showed no sign of recognizing the other kids, but they immediately fell into an easy rhythm of play, like siblings who'd never been apart. "Mom, can we go hiking with them after lunch?" Emma asked. "They know where the best rock formations are." "How do they know that?" Lisa asked carefully. "You just met them." "What do you mean, just met them?" Jake said. "We've been camping with them every year since forever." My hands started shaking. I turned off the camp stove and pulled Lisa aside. "We need to leave, right now. Something is very, very wrong here." "But the kids aren't acting like our kids. Look at them, Lisa. Really look at them." She did. Emma was showing the other girl how to braid friendship bracelets, but Emma had never shown interest in jewelry making before. Jake was helping the other boy build a fort out of sticks, but Jake usually played alone, preferring solitary activities like reading or drawing. "They're more social," Lisa whispered, "more outgoing. Emma's been shy her whole life, but look at her, she's leading the conversation with that girl." They're becoming the children from the photos, the children who've been camping here for years, who have these friends, who know these places. The realization hit both of us at the same time. We weren't just being haunted by a duplicate family, we were being replaced by them. Slowly, incrementally, our memories, our personalities, our very selves were being overwritten by versions that belonged in this place. "Pack everything," I said. "I don't care if the kids complain, we're leaving now." But packing while maintaining a facade of normalcy proved impossible. Every time we tried to take down the tent or load gear into the truck, one of the other family would come over to help or ask what we were doing. The kids kept wandering off to play, requiring constant retrieval. It was like trying to escape quicksand while pretending to enjoy a picnic. Leaving so early? The other David asked when he saw me rolling up sleeping bags. The weather's supposed to be perfect through the weekend. Besides, we haven't done our traditional fishing trip yet. We don't have a traditional fishing trip, I said firmly. Of course we do. He pulled out his phone again, showing me photos. Look, here's from last year. You caught that big bass, remember? You were so proud. The photo showed me holding a largemouth bass that must have weighed 3 pounds, grinning like an idiot. I was wearing the same flannel shirt I'd packed for this trip, standing by a creek I'd never seen before. But the joy on my face looked completely authentic. I don't fish, I repeated, but my voice sounded weak even to me. Looking at the photo, I could almost remember the weight of the fish in my hands, the satisfaction of a successful catch. Almost. Dad, Jake called from across the campsite, are you really going to make us leave before we catch fish? You promised we could try this year. I stared at my son. I had never promised anything about fishing. Jake knew I didn't fish. We'd talked about hiking and roasting marshmallows and looking at stars, but never fishing. I never promised that, Jake. He looked at me with genuine confusion. Yes, you did. Last winter, when we were planning the trip, you said this year you'd teach me to cast a line like Grandpa taught you. But my father had died when I was 12. He'd never taught me to fish. He'd been afraid of water, couldn't even swim. These weren't Jake's memories. They belonged to some other child, some other family, some other life. Jake, I said carefully. What's Grandpa's name? Grandpa Lewis. Dad. Your dad. Why are you asking weird questions? My father's name had been Robert. Luis was Lisa's father, still alive and living in Tucson. But Jake said it with such certainty, such casual familiarity, that I felt my own memories wobble. Had there been a Grandpa Luis? Was I forgetting my own father's name? That's when I realized the true horror of our situation. We weren't being replaced by doubles, we were being edited. Our memories, our personalities, our entire sense of self was being rewritten to fit this place, this eternal camping trip, this perfect family vacation that had somehow become a trap. I grabbed Lisa's hand. Now, we leave right now. But the tent, leave it, leave everything, just get in the truck. Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she immediately started moving. Kids, come on, we're going for a drive. Where? Emma asked, not looking up from her bracelet project. Anywhere, town, ice cream, I don't care, now. The other family watched us with expressions of polite concern as we herded our children toward the truck. Not alarm, not anger, just the mild worry you'd show for friends who were acting oddly. Drive safe, Maria called out. We'll keep an eye on your campsite while you're gone. I started the engine and put the truck in gear. But as we drove away, I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. The other family was standing by their campsite, all 4 of them, waving goodbye. But behind them, our campsite looked different. The tent we'd left standing was gone. Our camp chairs were folded and stacked neatly. Our fire was cold ashes. It looked like we'd never been there at all. Dad, Jake said from the back seat, why did we leave our camping stuff behind? We're coming back, I lied. When? I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. Because the truth was, I was starting to understand that some people who came to this place never really left. They might drive away, return to their normal lives, but part of them, the best part, the part that was happy and relaxed and whole, stayed here forever, camping with a perfect family in a perfect place where nothing ever went wrong. We drove straight home without stopping. 3 hours of tense silence, broken only by the kids' occasional complaints about the abandoned camping gear. Lisa and I didn't speak until we were safely in our own driveway, surrounded by the familiar chaos of suburban reality. What do we tell people? She asked finally. Nothing. Who would believe us? She nodded. The kids? Look at them. Emma and Jake were acting normal again, tired from the long drive, slightly disappointed about the abbreviated vacation, but recognizably themselves. Emma was reading in the back seat, antisocial in content. Jake was drawing elaborate battle scenes in a notebook, lost in his own imagination. Whatever had been changing them in that place seemed to have faded during the drive home. But that night, as I was tucking Jake into bed, he looked up at me with confused eyes. Dad? I keep trying to remember something about fishing, but I can't quite. Did you teach me to fish? I feel like you did, but I also feel like you didn't. I sat on the edge of his bed, studying his face in the dim light from the hallway. He looked like my son, sounded like my son, but in his eyes was a flicker of something else, a memory that didn't belong to him, trying to take root. "I don't fish, buddy. I never have. But Grandpa Luis, your grandpa's name is Robert. He died before you were born." Jake's forehead wrinkled with concentration. "Robert? Yeah, that's right. But then who's Grandpa Luis?" "Nobody," I said firmly. "Just a dream you had." He nodded slowly, but I could see him struggling with competing memories, trying to reconcile versions of reality that couldn't both be true. Over the next few days, the confusion faded. The foreign memories lost their grip, overwhelmed by the weight of real experience and the distance from that place. But sometimes, even now, I catch him staring out the window with a wistful expression, like he's trying to remember something beautiful that's just beyond his reach. It's been 6 months since our camping trip. We've never talked about going again, and the kids don't ask anymore. But I've done research, spent hours online reading about the area, about the campground, about other families who might have had similar experiences. What I've found keeps me awake some nights. Stories dating back decades. Families who went camping in those mountains and came back different. Children who remembered siblings they'd never had. Parents who spoke fondly of vacation traditions they'd never established. Always the same pattern, a perfect camping trip that seemed to extend beyond the bounds of reality, creating memories and relationships that shouldn't exist. Most disturbing were the missing person reports. Families who went camping and simply never returned. Not dead, not kidnapped, just gone, leaving behind lives they seemed to have abandoned willingly. Their friends and relatives described them as happy, excited about their trips, looking forward to their annual tradition of camping in places they'd never been before. I think I understand now what that place is, what it does. It's not evil, exactly. It's something much more subtle and dangerous. It's perfect. It offers the experience that every family thinks they want. Unlimited time together, kids who get along, parents who never fight about money or work, or whose turn it is to do dishes. It creates the vacation that exists only in our idealized memories, the family bonding experience that real life never quite delivers. But perfection has a price. To live in that eternal camping trip, you have to give up everything that makes you real. Your flaws, your struggles, your complex history, your uncertain future. You become the simplified, idealized version of yourself that belongs in a place like that. Some families, I think, make that trade willingly. They recognize the offer for what it is and choose to stay, to become the happy campers they always wanted to be. Their missing person reports remain open forever, because technically, they're not missing, they're exactly where they want to be. Others, like us, realize the cost is too high. We keep our messy, imperfect, difficult lives because they're ours. We stay in the world where memories can be painful, where families fight sometimes, where not every moment is precious and magical. But on particularly hard days when I'm under a stranger's house trying to fix a pipe that broke because the previous plumber was an idiot, when Lisa comes home exhausted from dealing with difficult parents and budget cuts, when the kids are fighting and the bills are piling up, I find myself thinking about that place, about the version of myself in those impossible photos, grinning and relaxed and completely happy. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we made the right choice. Lisa found the camping gear last week. It was in our garage, neatly organized and clean, as if we'd just returned from a successful trip. The tent was properly dried and folded. The sleeping bags were rolled tight. The camp stove was spotless. We never brought any of it home. We left everything at Site 8, abandoned it in our panic to escape. But there it was, waiting for us, ready for next year's camping trip. The kids found it too. Emma asked if we could go camping again this summer, maybe back to that same place that had such pretty stars. Jake wondered if we could learn to fish this time, like maybe my dad could teach us. Your grandpa's name was Robert, I reminded him, and he's been dead for 30 years. Right, Jake said, but he looked confused again. Robert, I know that, but I keep thinking, didn't I have another grandpa? One who was really good at fishing? Lisa and I looked at each other across the dinner table. In her eyes, I saw the same terrible understanding that was growing in me. It's not over. That place, that perfect family, those impossible memories, they're not confined to Site 8. They followed us home. Slowly, carefully, They're still trying to edit our lives, to make us into the people who belong in that eternal camping trip. Most nights, we resist. We remind each other of the real past, the actual timeline of our lives, the true names and faces of our family members. We fight to keep our authentic memories intact. But some nights, when I'm particularly tired, when the real world feels especially heavy, I find myself thinking it wouldn't be so bad to forget this complicated life and remember only the simple joy of camping with dear friends we've known forever. Some nights, I almost let it happen. The camping gear is still in the garage. And despite everything I know about that place, everything I understand about the cost of perfection, I haven't thrown it away. Just in case we decide to try one more time. After all, the kids are only 8 once. And they did love those stars.